The earliest Greek accounts of Medusa's origins can be traced to the primordial forces that shaped the ancient Mediterranean world, deeply rooted in genealogies that predate the well-known Olympian pantheon. According to Hesiod's Theogony, composed in the 8th century BC, Medusa emerged from a lineage of ancient sea deities, whose dominion extended over the mysterious depths and untamed waters surrounding the Greek world. Her parentage directly connects her to Phorcys and Ceto, two primordial beings whose names evoke the raw, untamed power of the ocean's depths. Phorcys, known as the Old Man of the Sea, represented the ancient pre-Olympian forces that governed the maritime realms. His domain encompassed not merely the surface waters familiar to Greek sailors, but the profound depths where light never penetrated, and strange creatures dwell beyond human comprehension. Ancient sources describe him as possessing gray hair and a beard that flowed like seaweed, his form shifting between human and marine characteristics. Ceto, whose name derives from the Greek word for sea monster, embodied the dangerous and unpredictable aspects of oceanic power. She was conceived as both a goddess and primordial sea creature, representing the fears that ancient mariners harbored about the unknown waters beyond their familiar coastal routes. The union of these two primordial deities produced a remarkable brood of offspring, each representing different aspects of ancient terror and wonder. Among their children were the Gree, the three gray sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them, the dragon Laden, who guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides, and, most significantly for our narrative, the three Gorgon sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. This genealogy firmly places the Gorgons within the category of chthonic deities, beings associated with the earth underworld and primordial forces that existed before the establishment of civilized order. Stheno, whose name means forceful or strong, was the eldest of the three sisters and was characterized by her particularly violent nature. Ancient sources describe her as the most aggressive of the Gorgons, responsible for killing more men than either of her sisters. Her immortal status, shared with Euryale, distinguished her from Medusa and established her as a permanent fixture in the cosmic order. Euryale, the wide-leaping sister, was noted for her loud cries that could be heard across vast distances. Her voice was said to be so piercing that it could shatter stone and drive mortals to madness. Like Stheno, she possessed immortality, ensuring her eternal presence as a force of primordial terror. Medusa, the youngest and only mortal sister, occupied a unique position within this triad. Her name, derived from the Greek word median, meaning to rule or to protect, suggests a more complex role than that of a simple monster. Early sources present her not as an inherently evil being, but as a powerful, protective force whose terrifying appearance served to ward off greater dangers. This protective aspect becomes crucial when examining the religious and cultural significance of Gorgon imagery in archaic Greek society. The religious significance of Gorgons in early Greek culture extended far beyond their role as mythological monsters. Archaeological evidence from the 7th and 6th centuries BC reveals extensive use of Gorgon imagery in religious contexts, particularly as apotropaic symbols designed to ward off evil influences. The distinctive Gorgon face, known as a Gorgonean, appeared on temple pediments, shields, coins, and household objects throughout the Greek world. These representations typically featured a round face with bulging eyes, a protruding tongue, wild hair often depicted as snakes, and prominent fangs. The apotropaic function of Gorgon imagery operated on the principle of sympathetic magic, where the terrifying appearance of the Gorgon was believed to frighten away malevolent spirits, enemies, and misfortune. This protective symbolism explains the prevalence of Gorgonean motifs on military equipment, where they serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Warriors believed that bearing the image of Medusa would not only intimidate their enemies, but also invoke divine protection in battle. Archaeological excavations have uncovered numerous examples of Gorgon imagery from the archaic period, providing concrete evidence of their cultural importance. The Temple of Artemis at Corfu, constructed around 590 to 580 BC, features one of the most spectacular examples of architectural Gorgon imagery. The western pediment displays a massive limestone Gorgonean, measuring over 9 feet in height, flanked by panthers and surrounded by smaller mythological figures. The scale and prominence of the sculpture demonstrate the central role that Gorgon imagery played in religious architecture. Pottery from this period provides additional insight into the evolution and significance of Gorgon motifs. Black figure pottery from the 6th century BC frequently depicts Gorgons in various contexts, from Perseus' quest to obtain Medusa's head to standalone aperture-opaque images on drinking vessels and storage jars. The artistic style of these representations shows remarkable consistency across different regions of the Greek world, suggesting a shared understanding of Gorgon iconography and its symbolic meaning. The standardization of Gorgon imagery across diverse Greek communities indicates the deep cultural penetration of these mythological figures. Coins from various city-states, including Athens, Neapolis, and Paphos, featured Gorgonian designs that served both as civic symbols and protective talismans. The monetary use of Gorgon imagery demonstrates how these ancient religious symbols became integrated into the daily economic life of Greek communities. Temple decorations from the archaic period reveal the sophisticated theological thinking that surrounded Gorgon imagery. The placement of Gorgonian motifs at temple entrances and on sacred vessels suggests that these symbols served as guardians of sacred space, protecting religious precincts from pollution or hostile influences. This protective function aligns with the broader Greek concept of the sacred as something that required careful maintenance and defense against corrupting forces. The artistic evolution of Gorgon representations during the 7th and 6th centuries BC reflects changing religious and cultural attitudes toward these primordial figures. Early depictions tend to emphasize the monstrous and terrifying aspects of the Gorgons, with exaggerated features and animalistic characteristics. As Greek artistic techniques became more sophisticated, Gorgon imagery began to incorporate more human elements while maintaining its essential aperture-opaque power. Regional variations in Gorgon imagery provide evidence for local religious traditions and cultural adaptations. Etruscan interpretations of Gorgon motifs, for example, often emphasize different aspects of mythology while maintaining the essential protective function. These variations demonstrate how the fundamental concept of the Gorgon as a protective force transcended specific cultural boundaries while adapting to local religious needs. The integration of Gorgon imagery into domestic contexts reveals the personal and familial dimensions of this religious symbolism. Household objects bearing Gorgonian motifs, including lamps, mirrors, and decorative vessels, indicate that protection from Gorgon imagery extended beyond public and military contexts into private life. Families sought the protective power of these ancient symbols to safeguard their homes and loved ones from various forms of harm. The prevalence of Gorgon motifs in funerary contexts adds another dimension to their religious significance. Grave goods and tomb decorations featuring Gorgon designs suggest beliefs about the protective power of these symbols in death as well as life. The presence of Gorgon imagery in burial contexts indicates sophisticated theological concepts about the continuation of protective power beyond mortal existence. The divine nature of the three Gorgon sisters reveals fundamental distinctions that shape their roles within Greek mythology and religious practice. While Stheno and Euryale possessed immortality, granting them eternal existence among the primordial forces of the cosmos, Medusa's mortality created a unique vulnerability that would ultimately define her mythological significance. This crucial difference in their divine status reflects deeper theological concepts about the relationship between permanent cosmic forces and those elements of the divine realm that could be altered or destroyed through heroic action. Stheno, whose name derives from the Greek word meaning strength or might, embodied the relentless, unchanging force of primordial power. Ancient sources consistently describe her as the most murderous of the three sisters, with an insatiable appetite for violence that never diminished across the centuries. Her immortal nature meant that this destructive force remained constant in the world, representing those aspects of divine terror that mortals could never hope to eliminate or overcome through conventional means. The permanence of her threat served as a reminder of the enduring presence of chaotic forces that existed beyond human control or understanding. Euryale, the wide-leaping sister, possessed abilities that distinguish her from both her siblings and other mythological beings. Her capacity for tremendous leaps allowed her to traverse vast distances instantaneously, making her an inescapable pursuer once she had identified a target. Ancient accounts describe her voice as particularly terrifying, capable of producing sounds so piercing and unnatural that they could shatter stone formations and drive listeners to immediate madness. This sonic weapon represented a form of divine power that operated through sound rather than sight, expanding the range of Gorgon abilities beyond the famous petrifying gaze associated primarily with Medusa. The immortality shared by Steno and Euryale placed them in a category of beings that existed outside the normal cycles of life and death that govern both mortal humans and many lesser supernatural entities. This eternal status meant that their influence on the world remained constant, providing a stable foundation of primordial terror that balanced against the ordered civilization represented by the Olympian gods. Their permanent presence in the cosmic order served essential functions in maintaining the boundaries between civilized and wild spaces, ensuring that certain regions remained forbidden to mortal intrusion. Medusa's mortality created a fundamental asymmetry within the sisterhood that had profound implications for her mythological role. Unlike her immortal sisters, she could be killed, making her the only member of the trio accessible to heroic intervention. This vulnerability did not diminish her power during her lifetime, but rather concentrated in a way that made her both more dangerous and more significant than her eternal siblings. Her mortality transformed her from a permanent cosmic force into a specific challenge that could be overcome through exceptional courage, divine assistance, and strategic planning. Ancient sources provide detailed descriptions of the Gorgon sisters' physical appearance that emphasize their supernatural nature and terrifying presence. Their bodies combined human and bestial characteristics in ways that violated natural order and created immediate revulsion in viewers. Bronze hands replaced normal human appendages, providing them with weapons that could tear through metal and stone with equal ease. These metallic extremities produced distinctive sounds when the sisters moved, creating an audible warning of their approach that added to their terrifying presence. Golden wings sprouted from their shoulders, enabling flight and marking them as beings that transcended earthly limitations. These wings differed from the feathered appendages typically associated with birds or divine messengers, instead resembling the metallic wings of insects magnified to enormous proportions. The golden coloration reflected light in ways that created disorienting visual effects, making it difficult for observers to track their movements accurately during flight. The wings produce a distinctive buzzing sound during flight that could be heard from considerable distances, serving as an additional element of their terrifying presence. The sisters' faces featured boar-like tusks that protruded from their mouths, creating a predatory appearance that emphasized their dangerous nature. These tusks grew continuously throughout their existence, requiring regular sharpening against stone surfaces to maintain their lethal effectiveness. Ancient accounts describe the tusks as capable of piercing bronze armor and crushing bone with minimal effort, making close combat with the Gorgons virtually impossible for mortal warriors. The tusks also serve as tools for feeding, allowing the sisters to consume prey that would be impossible for beings with normal human dentition to process. Perhaps the most distinctive and feared aspect of the Gorgon sisters' appearance was their hair, which consisted entirely of living serpents rather than normal human strands. These serpentine locks moved independently, creating a constantly shifting crown of venomous creatures that added to the sisters' supernatural appearance. The snakes varied in size and species, with some accounts describing vipers, cobras, and other deadly serpents intertwined among the larger specimens that formed the bulk of their hair. The serpents remained active and aggressive, striking at anything that came within range, and adding an additional layer of danger to any encounter with the Gorgons. The serpentine hair served multiple functions beyond simple intimidation. The snakes provided the sisters with enhanced sensory capabilities, detecting movement and heat signatures that might otherwise escape notice. This additional sensory input made it virtually impossible to approach the Gorgons undetected, as the serpents would alert their host to potential threats or prey from considerable distances. The snakes also served as weapons, extending the sisters' reach and providing them with venomous attacks that could incapacitate victims before the famous petrifying gaze took effect. Ancient geographical accounts place the dwelling of the Gorgon sisters in the far western reaches of the known world, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in regions that existed at the very edge of Greek geographical understanding. This location positioned them at the boundary between the civilized Mediterranean world and the unknown territories that lay beyond mortal exploration. The choice of this remote location emphasized their role as guardians of cosmic boundaries and their association with the primordial forces that existed before the establishment of human civilization. The proximity of their dwelling to the land of the Hesperides created a concentration of supernatural guardians In the western extremes of the world, the Hesperides, daughters of Atlas, tended the golden apples that granted immortality, while the dragon Ladon, another child of Phorcys and Ceto, served as their primary guardian. This clustering of protective supernatural beings in the western regions created a barrier that prevented unauthorized access to divine treasures and knowledge that could upset the cosmic order. Early Greek geographical understanding placed these western regions beyond the normal reach of mortal travelers, accessible only through divine intervention or exceptional heroic effort. The Pillars of Heracles marked the absolute limit of safe navigation for ordinary sailors, beyond which lay waters inhabited by sea monsters and supernatural dangers that could destroy entire fleets. The placement of the Gorgon sisters in these remote regions emphasized their role as ultimate guardians, beings whose very presence defined the boundaries of the accessible world. The sisters' dwelling itself is described as a desolate landscape of stone formations that reveal the extent of their petrifying power. Countless statues of men and animals littered the area around their home, created from those who had attempted to approach or challenge the Gorgons throughout the centuries. These stone figures served as both warning and testament to the sisters' deadly abilities, creating a sculptured garden of terror that demonstrated the futility of direct confrontation. The religious and mythological functions of the Gorgon sisters extended far beyond their role as monsters or obstacles for heroes to overcome. They served as essential guardians of sacred spaces, protecting boundaries between the mortal and divine realms that required supernatural enforcement. Their terrifying appearance and deadly abilities made them ideal sentinels for locations that mortals were forbidden to enter, ensuring that certain knowledge, treasures, or divine secrets remained protected from unauthorized access. The sisters' position as boundary guardians reflected ancient Greek concepts about the necessity of maintaining clear distinctions between different levels of existence. The divine realm contained powers and knowledge that could prove catastrophic if accessed by unprepared mortals, requiring guardians capable of enforcing these restrictions through overwhelming force. The Gorgons' combination of immortality, supernatural abilities, and unwavering hostility toward intruders made them perfect candidates for this essential cosmic function. Their role as protectors of sacred boundaries also connected them to broader themes of pollution and purification that permeated Greek religious thought. Unauthorized entry into sacred spaces could contaminate both the intruder and the protected area, requiring supernatural guardians who could prevent such violations through their mere presence. The Gorgons' ability to petrify intruders provided a form of ultimate purification, transforming potential polluters into harmless stone before they could complete their transgression. The transformation of Medusa from a beautiful mortal woman into the snake-haired monster of classical mythology represents one of the most complex and controversial narratives in ancient literature, with significantly different versions emerging across centuries of Greek and Roman storytelling. The evolution of this transformation myth reveals fundamental changes in religious thought, cultural values, and literary sensibilities as ancient Mediterranean civilizations developed their understanding of divine justice, sexual violence, and the relationship between gods and mortals. The earliest Greek sources present a markedly different account of Medusa's transformation than the version that became dominant in Roman literature. Archaic Greek texts, including fragments from poets like Pindar and references in early scholia, suggest that Medusa's monstrous appearance was not the result of a curse or punishment, but rather an inherent characteristic of her divine nature. These early accounts treat her terrifying form as a fundamental aspect of her identity as a primordial sea deity, similar to how other chthonic beings possess naturally frightening appearances that reflected their cosmic functions. Archaeological evidence from the 7th and 6th centuries BC supports this interpretation, as artistic representations of Medusa from this period show no indication that her monstrous features were acquired through transformation. Pottery, paintings, temple sculptures, and metalwork consistently depict her with serpentine hair, bronze hands, and a characteristic Gorgonian face, without any suggestion that these features represented a change from a previous human form. The artistic tradition of the archaic period treated her monstrous appearance as natural and permanent, reflecting theological concepts that emphasize a fundamental otherness of primordial deities. Classical Greek sources from the 5th and 4th centuries BC began to introduce elements of transformation into Medusa's story, though these early versions differed substantially from the later Roman accounts. Writers like Apollodorus and references in tragic fragments suggest that Medusa's transformation occurred as a consequence of divine displeasure, but the specific circumstances and moral implications vary considerably from later interpretations. These classical sources often emphasize themes of hubris and divine retribution rather than sexual violence and victim blaming that would characterize Roman versions. The most influential transformation narrative emerged from Ovid's Metamorphoses, composed during the early 1st century AD under the Roman Empire. Ovid's account fundamentally altered the nature of Medusa's story by introducing the element of sexual assault and transforming her from a willing participant in transgression to a victim of divine violence. According to Ovid's version, Medusa served as a priestess in Athena's temple, bound by vows of chastity that were essential to her religious duties. Her beauty attracted the attention of Poseidon, who pursued her relentlessly despite her attempts to maintain her sacred obligations. Ovid's narrative describes Poseidon's assault on Medusa within the sacred confines of Athena's temple, an act that violated multiple layers of religious and social taboos. The violation occurred in the most sacred space dedicated to the virgin goddess, contaminating both the physical temple and the religious purity that it represented. Poseidon's divine status made resistance impossible for Medusa, creating a situation where she became the victim of an assault that she could neither prevent nor escape. The location of the attack within Athena's temple added sacrilege to sexual violence, compounding the offense against both mortal and divine order. The Roman context of Ovid's writing significantly influenced his presentation of this narrative, as Roman legal and social concepts regarding sexual violence differ from earlier Greek perspectives. Roman law recognized the concept of rape as a crime against property and family honor, rather than primarily against the individual victim, creating legal frameworks that often blame victims for failing to prevent their own assault. This cultural background shaped Ovid's portrayal of Medusa's transformation as punishment rather than protection, reflecting Roman attitudes that held women responsible for maintaining their chastity regardless of circumstances. Athena's response to the desecration of her temple reveals the complex theological implications of divine justice in both Greek and Roman religious thought. Rather than punishing Poseidon, who, as her uncle and fellow Olympian deity, remained beyond her direct authority, Athena directed her wrath toward Medusa, transforming the priestess into a monster whose very gaze could turn living beings to stone. This punishment served multiple functions within the narrative structure, removing the evidence of temple desecration, while creating a being whose terrifying appearance will prevent future violations of sacred space. The theological problems inherent in Athena's punishment of Medusa, rather than Poseidon, reflect broader issues in ancient polytheistic systems regarding divine hierarchy and justice. Olympian deities operated within complex power structures that limited their ability to punish equals or superiors, forcing them to redirect their anger toward more vulnerable targets. Athena's position as a virgin goddess made the violation of her temple particularly offensive to her divine nature, but her inability to challenge Poseidon directly created a situation where justice could only be achieved through proxy punishment. Different interpretations of Athena's motivations emerged in various ancient sources, with some suggesting that the transformation served protective rather than punitive purposes. According to these alternative readings, Athena's curse actually shielded Medusa from future assault by making her appearance so terrifying that no one would dare approach her. This interpretation transforms a punishment into a form of divine protection, albeit one that isolated Medusa from human society and condemned her to a life of solitude and fear. The evolution of Medusa's transformation myth from archaic through classical to Roman periods reflects changing cultural attitudes toward sexuality, divine authority, and moral responsibility. Archaic Greek sources emphasize her role as a primordial force whose terrifying nature served cosmic functions, presenting her monstrous appearance as natural and necessary rather than as punishment for transgression. This early theological framework positioned the Gorgons as essential guardians whose frightening aspects protected sacred boundaries and maintained cosmic order. Classical Greek developments in the transformation narrative began to incorporate themes of divine justice and moral consequence. Though these early versions maintained greater ambiguity regarding blame and responsibility, the classical period's emphasis on tragic themes and moral complexity created space for interpretations that recognize the injustice inherent in punishing victims, while allowing perpetrators to escape consequences. Tragic fragments and scholia from this period suggest that contemporary audiences understood the problematic nature of divine justice as portrayed in these myths. Roman adaptations of the Medusa transformation story, particularly as presented in Ovid's Metamorphoses, introduce explicit themes of sexual violence, while simultaneously reinforcing cultural attitudes that blame victims for their own assault. The Roman legal and social context shaped these narratives in ways that reflected contemporary attitudes toward women's agency, sexual purity, and divine authority. Ovid's sophisticated literary technique allowed him to present these themes with apparent sympathy for Medusa, while reinforcing the cultural assumptions that made her punishment seem inevitable. The controversial nature of Poseidon's assault in Athena's temple extends beyond the immediate narrative to encompass broader questions about divine behavior and moral authority. In ancient literature, Poseidon's actions violated fundamental principles of sacred space, family relationships, and divine cooperation that were essential to maintaining cosmic order. His assault on a priestess within a fellow deity's temple represented a cascade of transgressions that threatened the stability of both divine and mortal realms. Ancient Greek concepts of sacred space emphasize the inviolability of temple precincts, which serve as neutral ground where even enemies could seek sanctuary and protection. The violation of the sacred space by a deity who should have respected its sanctity created theological problems that ancient writers struggled to address satisfactorily. Poseidon's status as both Athena's uncle and a major Olympian deity complicated attempts to assign appropriate punishment or consequences for his actions. The family relationship between Poseidon and Athena added additional layers of complexity to the narrative, as their kinship created obligations and limitations that affected their interactions. Ancient Greek society placed enormous emphasis on family loyalty and respect for elder relatives, making direct confrontation between Athena and her uncle problematic regardless of the justice of her cause. These cultural constraints force a narrative toward indirect forms of justice that ultimately victimize Medusa rather than addressing Poseidon's transgression directly. Roman religious and legal concepts provided different frameworks for understanding divine justice and sexual violence, though these often proved equally problematic for modern readers. Roman law recognized various forms of sexual assault existed within a legal system that often prioritized family honor and property rights over the rights of individual victims. This legal framework influenced how Roman writers portrayed sexual violence, creating stories that acknowledged the wrong while reinforcing social structures that protected the perpetrators, often at the victim's expense. The historical context of Roman literature during the early imperial period also shaped how divine authority and justice were depicted. Writers had to navigate a political landscape where criticizing those in power could be extremely dangerous. Ovid's own exile under Augustus shows the risks involved in creating literary works that challenge the established power structure, leading to a tendency to reinforce existing hierarchies rather than question them. The theological implications of Athena's punishment go beyond immediate questions of justice to touch on fundamental issues about the nature of divine authority and moral responsibility in polytheistic systems. Because Athena was a goddess of wisdom and justice, her response to the desecration of her temple was particularly significant. Her actions set precedents for how divine justice would be carried out in cases involving multiple deities and competing claims of authority. The transformation of Medusa into a monster whose gaze could turn people to stone made her existence itself a warning about the consequences of violating sacred spaces. This protective function changed her from a victim into a guardian, though she lost her humanity and social connections in the process. The theological implications of this transformation suggest complex ancient ideas about the relationship between suffering and sacred power, where being victimized could paradoxically create divine authority. Ancient religious thought recognized different kinds of divine justice that operated according to different principles and time scales in human legal systems. The punishment of Medusa instead of Poseidon reflects these alternative frameworks, where cosmic balance might be maintained through indirect consequences rather than direct retribution. These theological concepts led to narrative possibilities that modern readers often find morally problematic, but that reflected genuine ancient attempts to understand divine behavior and cosmic order. Medusa's petrifying gaze is one of the most unique and terrifying supernatural abilities described in ancient Mediterranean literature. Detailed descriptions appear in Greek and Roman sources over centuries, revealing both how this deadly power worked and what it meant culturally. Homer's Iliad is the earliest literary reference to the Gorgon's head, describing it as a fearsome object that adorned Athena's aegis, capable of striking terror into warriors and routing entire armies simply by being present on the battlefield. Homer's account emphasizes the psychological impact of the Gorgon's face rather than focusing on petrification, suggesting that early ideas about this power centered on overwhelming fear rather than physical transformation. The Homeric hymns expand on this initial description, providing more details about the nature of the Gorgon's deadly stare and its effects on both mortals and divine beings. These early sources describe the gaze as immediate and irreversible, transcending normal sensory experience and operating through direct visual contact that bypassed normal physical processes. The hymns emphasize that the petrifying effect happened instantly when someone met the Gorgon's eyes, leaving no chance for escape or protection once the fatal connection was made. Hesiod's Theogony adds crucial details about the scope and limitations of the petrifying gaze, stating that this power affected all living creatures, not just humans. Hesiod describes how birds fell from the sky as stone sculptures when they accidentally flew within sight of the Gorgons, while marine creatures became fossilized monuments on the ocean floor after encountering the sisters during their travels. This universal effect on living beings positioned the Gorgon's gaze as a fundamental force of nature rather than a targeted weapon, operating according to cosmic principles that govern life and death throughout the natural world. Classical sources from the 5th and 4th centuries BC provide increasingly sophisticated analyses of the petrifying gaze, with writers like Pindar and Aeschylus exploring theological and philosophical implications of the supernatural power. Pindar's fragmentary references suggest that the gaze operated through a form of divine emanation that transformed the essential nature of living beings, converting the animating principle that distinguished life from death into a static mineral form. This transformation affected not just the physical body but the fundamental life force itself, creating stone figures that retained perfect anatomical detail but completely lacked any spark of consciousness or vitality. Aeschylus introduces psychological dimensions to the petrifying gaze that would influence later literary treatments, describing how victims experience a moment of absolute terror before the transformation took effect. Aeschylus suggests that the petrification process involved a brief period of awareness during which victims understood their fate but were powerless to prevent it, creating a form of supernatural torture that combined physical transformation with psychological torment. This temporal dimension added complexity to the Gorgon's power, transforming it from a simple death sentence into a more elaborate form of divine punishment. Later classical sources, including works by Apollodorus and references in Tragic Scholia, provide technical details about the mechanics of the petrifying gaze, revealing ancient attempts to understand the supernatural phenomenon within existing frameworks of natural philosophy. These sources describe the gaze as operating through a form of emanation theory, with a Gorgon's eyes projected invisible forces that could alter the fundamental composition of matter at a distance. This theoretical framework placed the petrifying power within broader ancient concepts about vision and perception, suggesting that the Gorgons possessed an extreme version of abilities that existed in diminished form throughout the natural world. Hellenistic writers expanded on classical foundations to create more detailed classifications of the petrifying gaze's effect on different types of beings and materials. Sources from this period describe how the transformation affected organic and inorganic materials differently, with living creatures becoming perfect stone replicas, while inanimate objects remained largely unchanged. The selectivity of this effect suggested a sophisticated supernatural discrimination that could distinguish between different categories of existence, operating according to principles that transcended simple physical contact or proximity. Roman sources, particularly Ovid's Metamorphoses and Lucan's Pharsalia, provide the most detailed ancient descriptions of the petrification process, offering vivid accounts of how the transformation progressed through victims' bodies and the final appearance of the resulting stone figures. Ovid describes the process beginning with the extremities as fingers and toes gradually hardened into marble while victims retained consciousness and mobility in their core bodies. The transformation then proceeded inward, affecting limbs and torso before finally reaching vital organs and the brain, creating a prolonged experience of gradual paralysis and awareness of impending death. The Roman accounts emphasize the preservation of fine anatomical details in the petrified victims, describing how stone figures retain facial expressions, clothing textures, and even individual hair strands with perfect accuracy. This attention to detail served both literary and theological purposes, demonstrating the supernatural precision of the Gorgon's power while creating vivid imagery that enhanced the horror of the transformation process. The detail preservation also suggested that the petrifying gaze operated through principles that transcended normal death, creating a form of suspended animation that maintained physical form while eliminating all biological function. Symbolic interpretations of the deadly stare emerged early in ancient philosophical and religious discourse, with thinkers recognizing the Gorgon's gaze as a powerful metaphor for various forms of spiritual and psychological transformation. Presocratic philosophers, particularly those concerned with theories of perception and knowledge, used the petrifying gaze as an example of how direct encounter with ultimate reality could overwhelm human consciousness and render normal cognitive processes impossible. This philosophical framework positioned Medusa's power as representing the dangerous consequences of attempting to perceive truths that exceeded human capacity for understanding. Pythagorean philosophical traditions incorporated the Gorgon's gaze into their theories about the relationship between vision and spiritual transformation, suggesting that the petrifying power represented an extreme form of the visual processes that govern all forms of knowledge acquisition. According to these interpretations, ordinary vision involved a form of emanation between observer and observed that created understanding through mutual influence, while the Gorgon's gaze represented a catastrophic intensification of this process that destroyed the observer's capacity for independent existence. Platonic philosophical traditions developed sophisticated interpretations of the petrifying gaze that connected it to broader theories about reality, knowledge, and spiritual development. Platonic commentators suggested that the Gorgon's power represented the fate that awaited those who attempted to perceive the realm of pure forms without adequate philosophical preparation, becoming frozen in contemplation of truths that exceeded their capacity for comprehension. This interpretation transformed the deadly stare from a simple supernatural weapon into a complex allegory about the dangers and requirements of philosophical inquiry. Mystery religion traditions throughout the ancient Mediterranean world incorporated Gorgon imagery and symbolism into their initiation practices and theological frameworks, recognizing the petrifying gaze as representing various forms of spiritual death and rebirth. Dionysiac mysteries use Gorgon masks and imagery to represent the terrifying aspects of divine encounter that initiates must confront before achieving spiritual transformation. The deadly stare symbolized the necessity of ego death and the abandonment of ordinary consciousness that preceded mystical union with divine forces. Orphic religious traditions developed elaborate theological interpretations of the Gorgon's power that connected it to fundamental cosmic principles governing life, death, and spiritual transformation. Orphic texts describe the petrifying gaze as representing the power of divine justice that transforms souls according to their spiritual development and moral status. According to these interpretations, the stone transformation represented a form of purification that prepared souls for subsequent reincarnation or spiritual advancement rather than simple punishment or destruction. Egyptian mystery traditions that influenced Hellenistic religious thought incorporated Gorgon symbolism into their concepts of spiritual protection and transformation. Egyptian influenced texts describe the deadly stare as representing the power of divine wisdom that could either destroy unprepared souls or transform properly initiated individuals into beings of higher spiritual status. This dual interpretation recognized the Gorgon's gaze as possessing both destructive and transformative potential, depending on the spiritual condition of those who encountered it. Religious practices throughout the ancient world utilized Gorgon imagery as apotropaic symbols that could channel protective aspects of the deadly stare while avoiding its destructive potential. Temple decorations, amulets, and ritual objects featuring Gorgon designs were believed to project a dilutive form of the petrifying power that could ward off evil influences without harming legitimate worshippers or visitors. This practical application of Gorgon symbolism demonstrated an ancient understanding of the power's dual nature and the possibility of harnessing protective aspects through appropriate ritual frameworks. The paradox of Medusa's beauty and horror created one of the most complex and enduring themes in ancient art and literature, with artists and writers struggling to represent a being who combined irresistible attractiveness with deadly supernatural power. Early artistic representations from the archaic period emphasized the monstrous aspects of Medusa's appearance, creating Gorgon images that prioritize apotropaic function over aesthetic appeal. These early depictions featured exaggerated fangs, bulging eyes, protruding tongues, and wild serpentine hair that left no ambiguity about the figure's dangerous nature. Classical period artistic developments began to incorporate elements of beauty into Gorgon representations, creating increasingly sophisticated attempts to balance attractiveness with terror. Vase paintings from the 5th and 4th centuries BC show Medusa with more human facial features and proportions, though still maintaining the essential elements of serpentine hair and supernatural attributes that mark her divine status. These artistic innovations reflected changing cultural attitudes toward the relationship between beauty and danger, recognizing that the most effective supernatural threats might combine attractive and repulsive elements. Hellenistic artistic traditions pushed the beauty horror paradox to new levels of sophistication, creating representations of Medusa that emphasize her tragic status as a victim of divine punishment, while maintaining her terrifying supernatural power. Sculptures from this period often depicted her with classically beautiful facial features marred by expressions of pain or sorrow, surrounded by serpentine hair that writhed with apparent life. These artistic interpretations reflected Hellenistic literary developments that emphasized psychological complexity and emotional nuance in mythological narratives. Roman artistic representations of Medusa achieved perhaps the most successful balance between beauty and horror, creating images that simultaneously attracted and repelled viewers through careful manipulation of classical aesthetic principles. Roman mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures often depicted Medusa with perfect classical features that conformed to contemporary standards of feminine beauty, while incorporating subtle details that suggested her supernatural nature and deadly power. The serpentine hair in these representations often appeared almost decorative until closer examination revealed its threatening nature. The artistic challenge of representing Medusa's paradoxical nature extended beyond simple visual aesthetics to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between appearance and reality in supernatural beings. Artists had to develop techniques that could suggest the coexistence of contradictory qualities within a single figure, creating representations that acknowledge both the attractive and terrifying aspects of her nature without diminishing either element. This artistic problem reflected broader cultural tensions about the nature of divine power and its relationship to human understanding. Literary treatments of the beauty horror paradox and Medusa's appearance provided writers with opportunities to explore complex themes about desire, danger, and the relationship between physical attractiveness and moral character. Classical and Hellenistic authors developed sophisticated narrative techniques that could suggest Medusa's former beauty, while emphasizing her current monstrous state, creating tragic figures that evoke both sympathy and terror from audiences. The evolution of artistic representations across different historical periods reveals changing cultural attitudes toward feminine beauty, supernatural power, and the relationship between physical appearance and moral status. Archaic period emphasis on monstrous features reflected religious and cultural frameworks that prioritized apotropaic function over aesthetic appeal, while later developments incorporated increasingly complex psychological and emotional dimensions that reflected sophisticated literary and philosophical influences. Comparative analysis of petrifying deities and monsters in other ancient Mediterranean cultures reveals widespread mythological patterns that suggest common cultural concerns about supernatural vision and its deadly potential. Egyptian mythology includes several deities whose gaze possessed destructive power, including the goddess Sekhmet, whose eyes could bring plague and destruction to enemies of divine order. Sekhmet's leonine appearance and solar associations connected her deadly vision to cosmic forces of judgment and purification, creating parallels with Greek concepts of divine justice and supernatural punishment. The Egyptian god Set possessed eyes that could wither crops and bring disease to those who oppose divine will, representing another form of destructive supernatural vision that operated through direct visual contact. Set's association with chaos and disorder created mythological frameworks that parallel Greek concepts about primordial forces and their relationship to civilized order. The destructive power of Set's gaze serves similar functions to the Gorgon's petrifying stare, protecting divine prerogatives while punishing those who transgress cosmic boundaries. Mesopotamian mythology includes the demon Lamashtu, whose gaze could bring death to children and pregnant women, representing another form of supernatural vision that operated through direct eye contact. Lamishta's appearance combined human and animal features in ways that parallel Gorgon iconography, while her specific targeting of vulnerable populations reflected cultural concerns about protecting family structures and reproductive continuity. The apotropaic imagery used to ward off Lamishta's influence showed remarkable similarities to Greek Gorgon designs and functions. Anatolian religious traditions included various deities and demons whose eyes possessed supernatural power over life and death, creating mythological systems that recognize vision as a primary channel for divine influence on the mortal world. The Hittite storm god possessed eyes that could bring lightning and destruction to enemies, while various demon figures used deadly gazes to enforce supernatural justice and maintain cosmic order. These Anatolian traditions influenced Greek religious thought through cultural contact and exchange, contributing to the development of Gorgon mythology and its associated theological concepts. Phoenician and Canaanite mythological traditions included protective deities whose fierce appearance and supernatural gaze served apotropaic functions similar to those associated with Greek Gorgon imagery. Archaeological evidence from Phoenician sites reveals widespread use of protective face imagery that combine human and animal features in ways that parallel Gorgon designs, suggesting common Mediterranean cultural patterns regarding supernatural protection and visual symbolism. The widespread occurrence of petrifying or deadly gaze motifs across different ancient Mediterranean cultures suggests common psychological and cultural foundations that transcended specific religious and mythological systems. These shared patterns reflect fundamental human concerns about the power of vision, the relationship between appearance and reality, and the need for supernatural protection against cosmic forces that exceeded normal human capacity for resistance or understanding. The political machinations that led to Perseus's impossible quest began with King Polydectes of Seriphos, a ruler whose ambitions extended far beyond the governance of his small island kingdom. Polydectes had become infatuated with Dana, Perseus's mother, who had arrived on Seriphos years earlier as a castaway with her infant son after being cast adrift by her father, Acrisius of Argos. The king's brother, Dictys, a humble fisherman, had discovered the pair and provided them with shelter and protection, creating a household arrangement that frustrated Polydectes' romantic pursuits. Dana consistently rejected the king's advances, citing her devotion to Zeus, Perseus' divine father, and her contentment with her modest circumstances under Dictys' protection. As Perseus matured into a formidable young warrior, his presence became an increasingly significant obstacle to Polydectes' matrimonial ambitions. The young hero's fierce loyalty to his mother and his growing reputation for courage and strength made any attempt to force Dana into marriage politically and practically dangerous. Perseus had already demonstrated his willingness to confront authority figures who threatened his family's welfare, creating a situation where Polydectes could not simply override the young man's objections through royal decree or physical intimidation. The king recognized that direct confrontation with Perseus would likely result in his own death or exile, necessitating a more subtle approach to removing this obstacle. Polydectes devised a scheme that exploited the heroic culture's emphasis on honor, reputation, and the completion of seemingly impossible tasks. He announced his intention to marry Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa, and declared that all nobles and warriors on Seriphos must contribute wedding gifts appropriate to such a prestigious union. The king specifically demanded horses as gifts, knowing that Perseus, raised in modest circumstances by a fisherman, possessed neither horses nor the wealth necessary to acquire them. This deliberate exclusion created a public situation where Perseus's inability to provide an appropriate gift would result in social humiliation and loss of status within the warrior community. The trap reached its culmination when Perseus, stung by the implied slight to his honor and desperate to prove his worthiness despite his humble circumstances, made a rash boast that he could obtain any gift the king desired, even ahead of Medusa herself. Ancient sources suggest that Perseus made this declaration during a public feast where wine and competitive boasting had created an atmosphere conducive to such grandiose claims. Polydectes immediately seized upon this opportunity, formally accepting Perseus's offer and binding him through sacred oaths and public witnesses to fulfill his promise or face permanent exile and dishonor. The king's political calculation proved remarkably sophisticated. He had created a scenario where Perseus would either die attempting the impossible task or succeed in obtaining Medusa's head, which Polydectes could then claim for his own use as a powerful protective talisman and symbol of royal authority. Either outcome would remove Perseus as an obstacle to the king's matrimonial plans, while potentially providing Polydectes with supernatural power that would enhance his political position among neighboring kingdoms. The scheme demonstrated the complex interplay between personal ambition and political strategy that characterized leadership in the ancient Mediterranean world. The divine intervention that made Perseus' quest possible began with Athena's direct involvement, motivated by her complex relationship with Medusa and her role as patron goddess of heroes undertaking seemingly impossible tasks. Athena's appearance to Perseus occurred at the moment of his greatest despair, when the young hero had begun to comprehend the true magnitude of the challenge he had accepted. The goddess manifested in her full divine majesty, her gray eyes blazing with supernatural light, and her golden aegis displaying the terrible Gorgon that would soon be enhanced by the addition of Medusa's actual head. Athena's primary gift to Perseus was her polished bronze shield, a divine artifact that possessed reflective properties far superior to any mortal metalwork. The shield's surface had been crafted by Hephaestus himself, using techniques that combined divine metallurgy with supernatural enchantments to create a mirror-like finish that could reflect images with perfect clarity, while remaining unbreakable under any conceivable stress. The goddess explained that this shield would allow Perseus to observe Medusa's reflection without making direct eye contact, providing the only known method for approaching the Gorgon without succumbing to her petrifying gaze. The tactical significance of the mirrored shield extended beyond simple protection to encompass fundamental changes in combat methodology that Perseus would need to master. Fighting while observing an opponent through reflection required the development of entirely new spatial awareness and coordination skills, as the reverse image created disorientation that could prove fatal in combat situations. Athena provided Perseus with intensive training in mirror combat techniques, teaching him how to interpret reflected movements, judge distances accurately, and coordinate his own actions with the reverse visual information provided by the shield surface. Hermes' arrival followed shortly after Athena's initial contact, bringing additional divine assistance that would prove essential for the quest completion. The messenger god appeared in his traditional role as Psychopomp, the guide who conducted souls between different realms of existence, emphasized his function as a facilitator of journeys that transcended normal mortal limitations. Hermes' youthful appearance and quick wit provided a counterpoint to Athena's stern wisdom, creating a divine partnership that addressed both the practical and strategic aspects of Perseus' challenge. The winged sandals provided by Hermes represented one of the most crucial elements of divine assistance, as they granted Perseus the ability to traverse vast distances at supernatural speed while remaining airborne above terrestrial obstacles. These sandals, known as the Talaria, possessed golden wings that responded directly to the wearer's will, allowing for precise maneuvering in three-dimensional space that would prove essential when confronting flying opponents. The sandals also provided protection from earthbound dangers, enabling Perseus to travel across regions inhabited by monsters and hostile supernatural beings without risking ground-level encounters. Hermes also provided the adamantine sickle, a harvesting tool that had been used by Cronus to castrate his father, Uranus, and possessed the supernatural sharpness necessary to cut through the Gorgon's bronze skin and serpentine hair. The sickle's curved blade had been forged from adamant, a mythical substance harder than diamond and capable of cutting through any material in existence. The weapon's association with primordial divine violence and generational conflict made it particularly appropriate for use against beings like the Gorgons, who represented ancient cosmic forces that predated the current Olympian order. The cap of invisibility, known as the Helm of Hades, represented the third crucial element of divine assistance that would allow Perseus to approach his target undetected. This artifact had been crafted by the Cyclopes as a gift for Hades during the Titanomachy, providing the lord of the underworld with the ability to move unseen among both mortals and immortals. The cap's power operated through manipulation of light and perception rather than simple physical concealment, rendering the wearer completely undetectable to all forms of supernatural and natural observation. The psychological preparation required for using these divine artifacts proved as challenging as mastering their practical applications. Perseus had to overcome natural human instincts regarding flight, invisibility, and combat while maintaining the mental discipline necessary to coordinate multiple supernatural abilities simultaneously. The training process required him to develop new forms of spatial awareness and tactical thinking that incorporated three-dimensional movement, reverse visual information, and the strategic use of invisibility in combat situations. The quest's initial phase required Persis to locate the Gree, the three Grey sisters, who alone possessed knowledge of the Gorgon's current location in the far western reaches of the world. These ancient beings, daughters of Phorcys and Ceto, like their Gorgon sisters, dwelled in a desolate region where twilight reigned eternally, neither fully day nor completely night. The Gree had been born old, with gray hair, and shared a single eye and tooth among them. They had wiry hair and deeply wrinkled skin, and the three hags shared a single iron tooth and a single eye. They would pass these back and forth as needed to see or eat. Penfrido, Inio, and Dano each embodied different aspects of ancient wisdom and prophetic knowledge. Their names fittingly meant alarm, horror, and dread, respectively. These sisters possessed a unique ability to perceive events across vast distances and throughout time, making them invaluable sources of information, especially regarding the location and activities of their Gorgon sisters. Their immense age and supernatural knowledge, however, came at the cost of physical vulnerability. Their shared eye and tooth meant that they suffered from periods of blindness and helplessness, weaknesses that a clever antagonist could exploit. Perseus knew that approaching the Gree required meticulous timing and strategic planning. He needed to intercept the shared eye precisely as it was being transferred between sisters. The hero concealed himself using Hades' cap of invisibility and carefully observed the sisters' routine until he could identify the best moment to act. The Gree's predictable habit of passing the iron tooth, and I created brief opportunities when all three were simultaneously blind and vulnerable to a surprise attack. The successful theft of the shared eye occurred as Penfrido was passing it to Inio. This created a fleeting instant when neither sister could see, while Dano remained distracted, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. Perseus snatched the eye from the air between the sisters, instantly gaining leverage that would compel them to provide the information he needed. The hero's invisibility prevented the Gree from knowing his identity or location, adding psychological pressure and strengthening his negotiating position. The sisters' initial response was a mix of outrage, fear, and desperate attempts to bargain for the return of their shared eye. Without it, they faced permanent blindness, leaving them helpless against threats and unable to fulfill their cosmic duties. As guardians of ancient wisdom, Perseus, still invisible, explained his quest. He demanded specific information about the Gorgon's current location, the layout of their dwelling, and any other details that might help him complete his mission. The negotiation revealed the complex relationships within the primordial divine family, as the Gree expressed conflicted feelings about giving information that would lead to Medusa's death. While they felt obligated to protect their family, they also knew that Medusa's mortality meant her death was inevitable. Cooperating with Perseus might actually serve a greater cosmic purpose. The sisters ultimately agreed to provide the requested information in exchange of their eye, but they demanded assurances about Perseus's intentions and methods. The intelligence the Gree provided proved invaluable for planning the final approach to the Gorgon's lair. They had detailed knowledge of the terrain, defenses, and behavioral patterns that would determine whether Perseus succeeded. They described a location as a rocky island surrounded by treacherous waters, its shores guarded by the petrified remains of previous challengers. The Gorgons kept to irregular patrol schedules, with periods of sleep that offered the only chances for successful infiltration. Perseus' strategy incorporated the lessons he had learned from the Gree about timing, positioning, and exploiting specific vulnerabilities. The sisters emphasized that Medusa usually slept during midday, when the sun's position created optimal lighting for using the mirrored shield effectively. They also gave crucial details about the layout of the Gorgon's dwelling, including Medusa's preferred resting place and the best routes to minimize the risk of detection by her immortal sisters. Avoiding direct eye contact was more than just about preventing petrification. It was a broader tactical consideration that affected positioning, movement, and combat effectiveness. Perseus had to learn to maintain spatial awareness while observing his target only through reflection, developing new combat techniques based entirely on reverse visual information. This challenge forced him to overcome natural instincts related to visual confirmation and spatial orientation, developing mental disciplines that went beyond normal warrior training. The final approach to Medusa's lair required Perseus to coordinate multiple supernatural abilities while maintaining the mental discipline necessary to fight a being whose mere appearance could instantly kill him. Using Hermes' winged sandals, Perseus flew across the desolate waters surrounding the Gorgons' island. He stayed low to avoid detection, but high enough to see the terrain using Athena's polished shield. The island was a barren landscape of gray stone and twisted rock formations, littered with the petrified remains of those who had dared to venture too close. The stone figures scattered across the island told a grim tale of past attempts to challenge the Gorgons. Some statues showed warriors frozen mid-charge, weapons raised. Others depicted men caught in desperate flight, faces turned back in terror. Ships had been turned into stone monuments along the shore, their crews forever frozen in place. Some still manned oars, while others stood at the prow, hands shading their eyes as they stared toward the island's interior. The variety and number of petrified victims showed the Gorgons' deadly influence, serving as a stark reminder of the fate awaiting anyone who failed. Perseus located the Gorgons' dwelling by carefully observing the island's central plateau, where a natural amphitheater of rock formations offered shelter from the wind and clear views in all directions. The three sisters had arranged their living space to maximize their defenses, with sleeping area providing mutual protection and visibility over potential approach routes. Stheno and Euryale patrolled irregularly around the perimeter of their territory, their bronze wings creating a distinct sound that served as an early warning system. Perseus' timing was crucial. He arrived during midday, when Medusa usually slept while her immortal sisters remained vigilant. The Gree had told him this was the only window to approach Medusa without alerting Stheno and Euryale, whose supernatural senses could detect mortals from a distance. Perseus positioned himself on a rocky outcropping, giving him an elevated view while concealing him from the sisters' patrols. He used Hades' cap of invisibility for complete concealment, observing Medusa through the reflection in Athena's shield. Perseus saw the being who would become the focus of his impossible quest. Even in sleep, Medusa's appearance combined terrible beauty with supernatural horror, testing the hero's mental preparation and emotional stability. Her face retained the classical proportions and refined features that had once made her beautiful, but these features were now framed by writhing serpents that moved independently, even as she slept. Their scales caught the sunlight, creating an almost hypnotic effect. The serpentine hair was remarkably varied, with smaller vipers intertwined with larger pythons and cobras that formed the bulk of her supernatural crown. Some serpents seemed to sleep alongside their host, while others remained alert, their heads swaying gently as they tested the air for scents or sounds. The constant motion created an ever-shifting silhouette, making it hard to judge distances, even when observing to the shield's reflection. Perseus had to concentrate intensely to distinguish Medusa's actual position from the visual confusion created by her moving hair. Her bronze hands lay folded across her chest, their metallic surface bearing intricate engravings that seemed to shift and change as light played across them. The hands were larger than humanly possible, with fingers ending in claws that could tear through stone and metal with ease. Even in repose, these appendages suggested the immense physical power that complemented Medusa's supernatural abilities, making her a formidable opponent who could not be defeated through conventional methods. The golden wings folded against her back created geometric patterns resembling insects and birds. Their metallic feathers produced soft, chiming sounds when disturbed by the ocean breeze. The wings appeared delicate and beautiful from a distance, but closer observation to the shield revealed their true nature as weapons capable of generating tremendous force during flight. The wing surfaces bore intricate designs that incorporated both protective symbols and threatening imagery, creating a visual complexity that disoriented observers. Perseus began his approach by descending slowly from his vantage point, using the winged sandals to maintain complete silence as he navigated between the scattered stone figures. Each petrified victim required careful examination to ensure safe passage, as some statues retained weapons or posed in ways that created obstacles. The stone warriors served as grim reminders of the consequences of any mistake in timing or positioning. The hero's coordination of multiple supernatural abilities demanded unprecedented concentration and spatial awareness. He had to remain invisible using the cap of Hades while simultaneously controlling his flight with the winged sandals, all while observing his target solely through the reflected image in Athena's shield. The reversed visual information constantly challenged his judgment of distances and coordination of movements, forcing him to overcome natural instincts about spatial orientation and visual confirmation. The final approach required Perseus to position himself directly above Medusa's sleeping form, a maneuver that demanded precise control of the winged sandals while maintaining absolute silence. The hero had to account for wind patterns, the movement of Medusa's serpentine hair, and the patrol schedules of her immortal sisters, all while preparing to strike with Hermes' adamantine sickle. The slightest miscalculation would alert the Gorgons, resulting in instant death or petrification. Perseus raised the sickle above his head, its curved blade catching sunlight in brief flashes that he hoped would not attract the patrolling sisters. The weapon's supernatural sharpness allowed it to cut through Medusa's bronze skin and serpentine hair in a single stroke, but only if the blow landed with perfect accuracy at the junction between her neck and head. The hero had to coordinate this strike while observing his target through reflection, remaining invisible and preparing for immediate escape after the deed was done. The beheading happened with shocking swiftness as Perseus brought the adamantine sickle down in a single fluid motion, severing Medusa's head from her body before she could awaken or react. The supernatural blade cut through bronze skin, vertebrae, and serpentine hair with equal ease, creating a clean separation that prevented any chance of survival or regeneration. Medusa's eyes opened during the final instant, but her gaze met only empty air as Perseus maintained his position above and behind her head, avoiding direct eye contact even in death. The immediate aftermath of Medusa's death brought supernatural events that exceeded Perseus' expectations, forcing him to rapidly adapt his escape plans. As her severed head fell away, two beings sprang forth from the spilled blood with such sudden force that they nearly knocked the invisible hero off balance. The first creature was Pegasus, a magnificent winged horse whose pristine white coat and powerful frame immediately marked him as a divine being with extraordinary abilities. Pegasus had wings that combined the characteristics of both eagle and swan, with feathers that gleamed like polished silver and a wingspan exceeding 30 feet. The horse's body had perfect muscular definition and proportions that suggested both tremendous speed and enduring strength, while his eyes held intelligence that went beyond normal equine awareness. From the moment of his birth, Pegasus demonstrated his supernatural nature by taking immediate flight, his powerful wings creating wind currents that disturbed the surrounding stone figures and announced his presence to the entire island. The second being to emerge from Medusa's blood was Chrysaor, a giant warrior who appeared fully grown and armed with a golden sword that blazed with inner light. Chrysaor combined human and divine characteristics, with a physique that exceeded normal mortal proportions and features that suggested both nobility and terrible power. His golden armor seemed to be an extension of his body, creating protective coverage that could not be removed or damaged by conventional means. The giant's birth created a thunderous sound that echoed across the island, immediately alerting Steno and Euryale to their sister's fate. The mythological significance of these births from Medusa's blood connected to ancient Greek concepts about the relationship between death and generation, where the destruction of one form of life could lead to new beings with different characteristics and purposes. Pegasus represented the transformation of Medusa's earthbound terror into a creature of air and inspiration, whose wings carried him beyond the limitations that had defined his mother's existence. The winged horse's association with poetic inspiration and divine messages transformed him into a positive force, channeling the supernatural power of his Gorgon heritage toward creative rather than destructive ends. Chrysaor's emergence as a fully armed giant warrior suggested a continuation of Medusa's protective functions through a being capable of active defense rather than passive deterrence. The golden warrior inherited his mother's role as a guardian of sacred boundaries, but his human form and noble bearing allowed him to interact with mortals and gods in ways that had been impossible for the monstrous Gorgon. His golden sword became a symbol of divine justice, able to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate claims to protected treasures or territories. The birth of these two beings from Medusa's blood also fulfilled ancient prophecies about the consequences of her death. Ancient traditions had long predicted that the Gorgon's destruction would unleash forces that would reshape the balance between mortal and divine realms. Pegasus's role as the mount of future heroes, particularly Bellerophon in his battle against the Chimera, showed how Medusa's death contributed to later heroic endeavors. The winged horse's assistance to heroes was a form of posthumous redemption for his mother, whose terrifying power was transformed into aid for those seeking to protect civilization from monstrous threats. Chrysaor's role as the father of Geryon, the three-bodied giant who would later be defeated by Heracles, created genealogical connections that linked Medusa's death to future heroic cycles. The Golden Warrior's offspring inherited aspects of their grandmother's supernatural nature, serving as challenges that tested the abilities of later heroes. This ensured that Medusa's influence on Greek mythology extended far beyond her own death, creating lasting impacts on the cosmic order that governed relationships between heroes, monsters, and divine forces. Perseus' escape from pursuing immortal sisters required immediate use of all his supernatural abilities, while carrying Medusa's severed head, whose petrifying power remained active even after death. The hero quickly placed the head in a special bag provided by Athena, designed to contain the deadly gaze while allowing him to access its power when needed. The bag itself had protective enchantments that prevented the petrifying effect from harming its carrier, while maintaining the head's supernatural potency for future use. Stheno and Euryale responded to their sister's death with a combination of grief, rage, and supernatural fury, immediately pursuing the invisible hero. The immortal sisters possessed tracking abilities that operated independently of normal vision, allowing them to follow Perseus' trail through supernatural senses that detected divine artifacts and heroic presence. Their bronze wings created thunderous sounds as they took flight, their voices raised in keening wails that could be heard across vast distances and struck terror into the hearts of mortals within range. The pursuit became a supernatural chase across the Mediterranean, with Perseus using every advantage his divine equipment gave him to stay ahead of the vengeful Gorgons. The winged sandals allowed him to reach speeds beyond normal flight, while the cap of invisibility prevented visual tracking that might have allowed the sisters to anticipate his movements. However, Stheno and Euryale's immortal nature gave them unlimited endurance, threatening to overcome Perseus' advantages through sheer persistence. The chase took Perseus across regions inhabited by various supernatural beings and monsters, many of whom were alerted to pursuit by the Gorgons' wailing cries and the disturbances created by high-speed flight. Sea monsters rose from the depths to observe the spectacle, while sky spirits and wind deities gathered to witness this unprecedented event. The supernatural nature of the pursuit created atmospheric disturbances that affected weather patterns and ocean currents, leaving lasting marks on the regions the chase passed through. Perseus' eventual escape required strategic use of terrain features and divine assistance, allowing him to break the tracking abilities that enabled the Gorgons to follow him. The hero sought refuge in sacred groves and temple precincts where divine protection limited the sisters' ability to pursue him, creating temporary sanctuaries for rest and planning. Athena's continued guidance helped Perseus identify safe routes and timing that maximized his advantages while minimizing his exposure to recapture. The symbolic interpretations of Perseus' victory over Medusa resonated throughout Greek culture and religion, representing the triumph of heroic order over primordial chaos in ways that address fundamental concerns about civilization's relationship to natural and supernatural forces. The hero's success showed that even the most terrifying aspects of the cosmos could be overcome through preparation, divine assistance, and exceptional courage, providing a model for human engagement with forces that exceeded normal mortal capabilities. The victory represented the subordination of ancient chthonic powers to the newer Olympian order. Perseus' divine sponsors, Athena and Hermes, represented the current generation of gods who had displaced earlier primordial deities through superior organization and strategic thinking. Medusa's death symbolized the transformation of raw supernatural terror into controlled divine power that could be channeled toward detective purposes, as demonstrated by the subsequent use of her head as an apotropaic device. The hero's use of reflection rather than direct confrontation provided a metaphor for the intellectual and strategic approach that characterized classical Greek culture's relationship to dangerous knowledge and supernatural forces. Instead of meeting terror with terror or attempting to overcome supernatural power through brute force, Perseus succeeded through cleverness, preparation, and strategic use of divine gifts that enhance rather than replace human capabilities. This reflected Greek values that emphasized intelligence and planning over simple courage or physical strength. The transformation of Medusa's head into a protective talisman showed Greek concepts about the potential for converting destructive forces into beneficial ones, through proper understanding and application. The Gorgon Neon became one of the most powerful apotropaic symbols in ancient Mediterranean culture, protecting temples, cities, and individuals from harm, while serving as a reminder of the hero's victory over primordial terror. This transformation represented the civilizing process through which dangerous natural forces could be tamed and channeled toward protective purposes. Perseus' possession of Medusa's severed head transformed him from a desperate young hero into one of the most formidable warriors in the ancient world, wielding a weapon whose power exceeded conventional understanding of combat and supernatural force. The head retained all of its petrifying abilities even after separation from Medusa's body, creating a portable source of divine terror that could instantly neutralize any threat through direct visual contact. The preservation of this power defied normal expectations about death and decay, showing that certain supernatural abilities transcended the physical limitations that governed mortal existence. The practical challenges of carrying such a dangerous artifact required careful management and specialized equipment that protected Perseus while maintaining the head's accessibility for combat. Athena's specially crafted bag, woven from materials that existed only in divine realms, completely contained a petrifying gaze while allowing rapid deployment when needed. The bag's interior remained perpetually dark, preventing any accidental activation of the head's power, while its exterior bore protective symbols that warded off attempts by other supernatural beings to steal or corrupt this potent weapon. Perseus' first chance to test his new weapon came during his encounter with Atlas, the titan who held the heavens on his shoulders in the far western regions of the world. Atlas had been warned by an oracle that a son of Zeus would eventually steal the golden apples from his daughter's garden, leading him to refuse hospitality to all travelers claiming divine parentage. When Perseus requested shelter and provisions for his journey home, Atlas responded with hostility, using his tremendous size and strength to threaten the hero. The confrontation escalated as Atlas tried to crush Perseus with boulders torn from nearby mountains, forcing the hero to reveal Medusa's head in self-defense. The moment Atlas looked at the Gorgon's features, his massive form began to transform from living flesh to solid stone, starting with his extremities and moving inward toward his vital organs. Because of the Titan's enormous size, the petrification process took longer than normal, allowing Perseus to observe the complete transformation as Atlas's body became the Atlas Mountains. His head formed the highest peak, while his shoulders and arms created the distinctive ridges that would bear his name. The creation of the Atlas Mountain Range through Medusa's power showed the head's ability to affect beings of divine or semi-divine status, proving that its petrifying capabilities operated according to principles beyond mortality and immortality. Atlas's transformation also revealed that the head's power could create permanent geographical features rather than just statues, suggesting that the scale and nature of the transformation depended on the target's size, power, and cosmic significance. The mountains created from Atlas's body retained certain characteristics of their origin, showing unusual mineral compositions and atmospheric phenomena that reflected their supernatural genesis. Perseus' subsequent journey brought him to the coast of Ethiopia, where he found Andromeda chained to coastal rocks as a sacrifice to the sea monster Cetus. The princess had been offered to appease Poseidon's wrath after her mother, Cassiopeia, boasted that Andromeda's beauty exceeded that of the Nereids, causing divine offense that threatened the entire kingdom. King Cepheus had consulted the oracle of Ammon, who declared that only the sacrifice of his daughter could save his people from the sea god's vengeance, leading to Andromeda's current predicament. The approaching sea monster was one of Poseidon's most terrifying servants, a creature whose size and ferocity had terrorized Mediterranean coastlines for centuries. Cetus had features of both whale and dragon, with a serpentine body over 200 feet long, and a head equipped with multiple rows of teeth that could crush warships. The monster's hide seemed almost metallic, with scales that deflected conventional weapons, while its eyes glowed with a supernatural intelligence that suggested awareness beyond normal animal consciousness. Perseus' aerial combat with Cetus required innovative tactics that combined his divine equipment with strategic use of Medusa's head as both a weapon and shield. The hero used his winged sandals to stay airborne, harassing the sea monster with hit-and-run attacks, striking at vulnerable points along Cetus' spine and neck while avoiding the creature's massive jaws and thrashing tail. The monster's aquatic nature allowed it to submerge and resurface unpredictably, creating combat challenges that tested Perseus' ability to coordinate flight, invisibility, and weapon use at the same time. The decisive moment came when Perseus managed the Euro. To position himself perfectly, Perseus waited for one of the monster's lunging attacks aimed at Andromeda. Then, relying on his invisibility to remain unseen, he revealed Medusa's head the very instant the sea monster's eyes looked up, establishing direct eye contact that instantly turned it to stone. The transformation of such a huge creature produced a spectacular visual show as Cetus's body gradually turned to solid rock. Its final, petrified form created a new landmark that would guide sailors for generations to come. Andromeda's rescue cemented Perseus' reputation as a hero who could overcome seemingly impossible odds through clever strategies and the proper use of gifts from the gods. The princess's deep gratitude and her father's immense relief quickly led to talks of marriage, though these were complicated by Andromeda's prior betrothal to her uncle, Phineus. The political ramifications of this romantic entanglement created tensions that would soon force Perseus to use Medusa's head to defend his new bride and her family's honor. Phineus arrived at the wedding festivities with a sizable armed force, asserting his prior claim to Andromeda and demanding that Perseus relinquish his bride or face the consequences of defying established political agreements. The confrontation unfolded in King Cepheus's great hall, where wedding guests found themselves caught in the middle of competing claims of legitimacy and honor. Phineus's supporters included several hundred seasoned warriors who had served him in previous campaigns, creating overwhelming numerical superiority against Perseus and his few allies within Cepheus's court. The ensuing battle vividly demonstrated Medusa's head's effectiveness in confined spaces and against multiple opponents. Perseus strategically used the weapon's petrifying power to neutralize entire groups of attackers simultaneously. The hero's tactical approach involved careful positioning that allowed him to expose the head to the maximum number of enemies, while safeguard his allies through precise control of sight lines and timing. The Great Hall's limited space actually worked to Perseus' advantage, as the densely packed warriors couldn't avoid looking in his direction when he revealed his supernatural weapon. The transformation of Phineus' army created one of the most remarkable displays of the head's power ever recorded in ancient accounts, with nearly 200 warriors frozen into stone statues in various poses of attack and defense. Some figures were caught mid-charge, weapons raised, while others desperately tried to shield their eyes or flee towards the hall's exits. The detailed preservation of facial expressions and body positions created a permanent monument to the battle. Each statue told a part of the story of Perseus' triumph over superior numbers through supernatural means. Phineus himself proved a more difficult challenge to defeat. His awareness of Perseus' weapon allowed him to use mirrors and reflective surfaces in attempts to turn the head's power against its wielder. The uncle's tactical acumen and combat experience led to a prolonged duel that tested Perseus' skill in mirror combat techniques, which he learned during his training with Athena. The final confrontation required Perseus to outmaneuver Phineus' defensive strategies while avoiding the traps and ambushes the experienced warrior had set throughout the hall. Perseus ultimately defeated Phineus by using the polished surface of the ceremonial shield to redirect the head's petrifying gaze, creating a complex series of reflections that allowed him to target his opponent while avoiding direct eye contact himself. Phineus' transformation marked the end of organized resistance to Perseus' marriage. Though the political fallout from eliminating an entire rival faction would influence Ethiopian court politics for generations to come, Perseus' journey back to Seriphos provided further opportunities to use Medusa's head against various threats and obstacles along his path across the Mediterranean world. Bandits and pirates who tried to rob the hero found themselves transformed into stone landmarks, serving as warnings to future criminals. Hostile supernatural beings learned to avoid regions where Perseus had demonstrated his weapon's power. The head's reputation began to precede its wielder, creating psychological advantages that often resolved conflicts without requiring actual combat. The hero's route home took him through regions where various Mediterranean peoples would later claim descent from his actions or incorporate his deeds into their foundational myths. Coastal communities in Libya reported that drops of blood from Medusa's head, spilled during Perseus' flight, had created the first venomous serpents in their region, explaining the dangerous wildlife that characterized certain desert areas. These origin stories connected local geographical features and natural phenomena to the cosmic significance of Perseus' quest, creating cultural narratives that validated community identity through association with heroic deeds. Egyptian priestly traditions integrated Perseus's victory over Medusa into their theological frameworks, interpreting the hero's success as a triumph of solar order over chaotic darkness that threatened cosmic stability. Temple records from this period describe ritual reenactments of Perseus's quest, serving both religious and political functions and reinforcing pharaonic authority through association with divine victory over primordial forces. The head's petrifying power was understood to represent the ability of properly consecrated royal authority to transform enemies of order into harmless monuments. Phoenician trading communities spread tales of Perseus's deeds throughout their commercial networks, creating variations that emphasize different aspects of the hero's achievements depending on local cultural values and concerns. Some versions focus on Perseus's strategic thinking and proper use of divine gifts, while others emphasize the importance of maintaining proper relationships with patron deities who could provide essential assistance during times of crisis. The head's power served as a metaphor for protective benefits that came from maintaining correct religious observances and commercial practices. Perseus's eventual return to Seriphos brought him into direct confrontation with King Polydectes, whose original scheme had launched the entire quest, but who now faced a hero armed with supernatural power that exceeded any conventional military force. Polydectes had used Perseus's absence to intensify his pursuit of Dana, eventually resorting to threats and coercion that drove her to seek sanctuary in a temple dedicated to Zeus. The king's violation of sacred asylum and his abuse of royal authority created a justification for Perseus to employ extreme measures in defense of his mother's honor and safety. The confrontation took place in Polydectes' throne room, where the king had assembled his court to witness what he expected would be Perseus' admission of failure and subsequent exile from the island. Instead, Perseus arrived carrying proof of his quest completion, though he kept Medusa's head concealed until the appropriate moment for revelation. The king's initial disbelief and mockery quickly transformed into terror as Perseus began to unwrap his supernatural trophy, creating dramatic tension that emphasized the reversal of power relationships that the quest had accomplished. The petrification of Polydectes and his supporters occurred with the same instantaneous effect that had characterized the head's previous uses, transforming the royal court into a sculpture gallery that preserved the moment of their realization that Perseus had indeed accomplished the impossible task. The king's statue retained his expression of shocked comprehension, creating a permanent monument to the consequences of underestimating heroic determination and divine assistance. The transformation of the entire court eliminated the political structure that had oppressed Dana, while providing Perseus with undisputed control over Seriphos. Ancient beliefs about the continued power of Medusa's severed head extended far beyond its immediate military applications to encompass broader concepts about apotropaic protection and the channeling of divine force through material objects. Religious traditions throughout the Mediterranean world recognize that certain supernatural powers could be preserved and transmitted through physical artifacts, creating sacred objects whose potency derived from their connection to cosmic forces rather than simple craftsmanship or artistic skill. The head's apotropaic properties operated through principles that combined visual intimidation with genuine supernatural protection, creating defensive capabilities that function against both natural and supernatural threats. Temple decorations incorporating Gorgonian imagery drew upon diluted versions of the head's power, providing protective benefits that could ward off evil influences without risking the catastrophic effects of direct contact with the actual artifact. These symbolic applications demonstrated an ancient understanding of how supernatural power could be channeled and controlled through appropriate ritual frameworks and artistic representation. Military applications of Gorgonian symbolism became widespread throughout Greek armies, with shields, armor, and standards bearing Medusa's image to invoke protective benefits during combat. Soldiers believed that carrying these symbols would provide divine protection while intimidating enemies who recognized the mythological associations. The psychological impact often proved as valuable as any supernatural benefits, as opponents who understood the symbolism might hesitate or lose confidence when facing warriors who claimed a connection to Perseus's legendary victory. The head's influence on Mediterranean religious practices extended to mystery cults and initiation rituals that use Medusa imagery to represent various forms of spiritual transformation and divine encounter. Initiates learned to interpret the Gorgon's terrifying appearance as representing the overwhelming nature of direct divine contact, which could either destroy unprepared souls or transform properly prepared individuals into beings of higher spiritual status. These religious applications transformed the head's deadly power into a symbol of spiritual death and rebirth that transcended simple physical destruction. The presentation of Medusa's severed head to Athena marked a pivotal transformation in Greek religious practice, converting a weapon of individual heroic achievement into a permanent symbol of divine protection that would influence Mediterranean civilization for centuries. Perseus approached the goddess at her temple in Athens, carrying the head in his protective wrapping while accompanied by his new bride, Andromeda, and his mother, Dana, both of whom had witnessed the head's terrible power during their journey from Ethiopia. The hero understood that his possession of such a potent supernatural artifact created responsibilities that extended beyond personal use, requiring divine guidance about its proper disposition and future role in maintaining cosmic order. Athena received the offering with formal ceremony that acknowledged both Perseus' heroic achievement and the head's significance as a relic of primordial divine power. The goddess examined the severed head, paying particular attention to the preservation of its supernatural properties, noting that the petrifying gaze remained as potent in death as it had been during Medusa's lifetime. The serpentine hair continued to writhe with independent motion, each snake maintaining its venomous nature, while contributing to the overall effect of supernatural terror that made direct observation impossible for ordinary mortals. The integration of Medusa's head into Athena's aegis required sophisticated divine craftsmanship that could harness the head's power while preventing accidental harm to the goddess's worshippers and allies. Hephaestus, the divine smith, created a special mounting system that secured the head to the center of the aegis, while channeling its petrifying energy through the shield's bronze surface. The mounting incorporated protective barriers that prevented the head's gaze from affecting anyone positioned behind the aegis, while allowing its full power to be directed against enemies and threats to divine order. The aegis itself underwent a transformation to accommodate its new central element, with the shield's surface developing additional protective properties that complemented the head's petrifying power. The bronze acquired a mirror-like quality that could reflect hostile magic back toward its source, while the shield's edges gained the ability to generate defensive barriers of supernatural force. These enhancements created a comprehensive protective system that combined physical defense with supernatural deterrence, establishing the aegis as one of the most formidable defensive artifacts in the divine arsenal. Athena's first public display of the enhanced aegis occurred during a conflict between Athens and rival city-states that had formed an alliance to challenge Athenian commercial dominance in the Aegean region. The goddess appeared above the battlefield wearing her complete panoply, with the aegis prominently displayed across her chest and Medusa's head clearly visible at its center. The psychological impact proved immediate and decisive, as enemy forces recognized the implications of facing divine protection enhanced by the Gorgon's legendary power. Many soldiers fled without engaging in combat, while others surrendered rather than risk confrontation with such overwhelming supernatural force. The battlefield demonstration established precedents for the aegis's use in protecting Athenian interests while serving broader functions of maintaining order and justice throughout the Greek world. Athena's selected deployment of the enhanced aegis sent clear messages about divine approval or disapproval of various political and military actions, creating a form of supernatural diplomacy that influenced decision-making processes across multiple city-states. Rulers learned to consider potential divine reactions when planning military campaigns or political initiatives that might attract Athena's attention. The transformation of Medusa from a terrifying monster to a protected divine symbol reflected fundamental changes in Greek religious understanding during the classical period, as theological concepts evolved to accommodate more sophisticated relationships between destructive and beneficial supernatural forces. Earlier archaic period religious practices had emphasized the separation between beneficial and harmful divine influences, creating clear distinctions between gods who protected communities and monsters who threatened them. The integration of Medusa's power into Athena's protective apparatus demonstrated more nuanced theological thinking that recognized the potential for transforming dangerous forces into beneficial ones through proper divine management. Athenian religious practices incorporated the enhanced aegis into various ceremonial contexts that emphasized the city's special relationship with divine protection and cosmic order. The Panathenaic festival featured elaborate processions where Athena's statue, equipped with a replica of the Medusa enhanced aegis, was carried through the city streets while citizens offered prayers for continued protection and prosperity. These ceremonies reinforced community identity while demonstrating Athens' claim to divine favor that distinguished it from rival city-states lacking similar supernatural patronage. Temple rituals developed specific protocols for invoking the Aegis' protective power during times of crisis or threat to the community. Priests learned ceremonial techniques for requesting Athena's intervention, while properly acknowledging the dangerous nature of the power they sought to invoke. These rituals required extensive purification procedures and protective measures that prevented accidental harm. The participants, while ensuring that divine assistance would be directed against legitimate threats rather than innocent bystanders. The theological implications of housing Medusa's head within Athena's aegis created complex interpretations about the relationship between justice and terror in divine governance. Religious scholars debated whether the head's presence represented Athena's willingness to employ extreme measures in defense of justice or symbolized the goddess's ability to control and redirect chaotic forces toward beneficial purposes. These discussions influenced legal and political theory as Athenian thinkers developed concepts of legitimate authority that incorporated both protective and punitive aspects of divine power. The Gorgonean, as Medusa's head came to be known in artistic and religious contexts, rapidly became one of the most recognizable and widely used motifs in Greek visual culture. Artists developed standardized iconographic conventions for representing a head that balanced its terrifying supernatural nature with aesthetic requirements for architectural and decorative applications. Early classical representations emphasized the monstrous aspect of the Gorgon, featuring prominent fangs, bulging eyes, and wild serpentine hair that created immediate visual impact while serving apotropaic functions. Architectural applications of Gorgonean imagery appeared on temple pediments, where large-scale sculptures served both decorative and protective purposes for sacred buildings. The Temple of Athena at Aegina featured a prominent Gorgonean on its western pediment, positioned to guard the building's main entrance while demonstrating the temple's connection to divine protection. The sculpture's placement created psychological barriers that reminded visitors of the supernatural forces that protected the sacred space, while warning potential desecrators about the consequences of inappropriate behavior. Coins from various Greek city-states incorporated Gorgonean designs that served multiple functions as civic symbols, protective talismans, and markers of political authority. Athenian tetradrachms featured particularly sophisticated representations that combined artistic excellence with apotropaic effectiveness, creating currency that carried protective power along with economic value. The widespread circulation of these coins spread Gorgonean imagery throughout Mediterranean trade networks, establishing the motif as a recognized symbol of Greek cultural and religious identity. Pottery decorations utilized Gorgonean motifs in various contexts that range from purely decorative applications to functional apotropaic uses on vessels intended for religious ceremonies. Black figure and red figure pottery from the 6th and 5th centuries BC featured increasingly sophisticated artistic interpretations that explored different aspects of the Gorgon's mythological significance. Some vessels depicted narrative scenes from Perseus' quest, while others used standalone Gorgonean images as protective symbols that would safeguard the contents and users of the pottery. Military equipment incorporated Gorgonean imagery as both protective symbols and psychological weapons that could intimidate enemies, while providing supernatural assistance to their bearers. Shield blazons featuring Medusa's head became particularly popular among elite warriors who sought to associate themselves with Perseus' legendary victory, while invoking divine protection during combat. The shield's reflective bronze surfaces created additional visual effects that enhanced the Gorgonean psychological impact, as sunlight reflected from the polished metal could create disorienting flashes that confused opponents. Jewelry and personal ornaments featuring Gorgon designs provided individuals with portable protective symbols that could ward off various forms of harm while demonstrating their connection to Greek religious and cultural traditions. Wealthy citizens commissioned elaborate pieces that combined precious metals with detailed artistic representations of Medusa's head, creating luxury items that serve both aesthetic and spiritual functions. These personal talismans became particularly popular among women, who appreciated the Gorgon's protective properties while recognizing its connection to feminine divine power. The evolution of Gorgonean imagery from purely monstrous representations towards more humanized depictions reflected changing cultural attitudes toward beauty, terror, and the relationship between physical appearance and spiritual power. Late classical and Hellenistic artists began incorporating elements of conventional feminine beauty into their Gorgon designs, creating representations that combine attractive features with supernatural attributes in ways that emphasize the tragic aspects of Medusa's transformation. The artistic challenge of representing both beauty and horror within a single image pushed Greek artists to develop sophisticated techniques for suggesting contradictory qualities through careful manipulation of facial features and expressions. Sculptors learned to create faces that appeared beautiful from certain angles while revealing terrifying aspects when viewed from different perspectives, using the three-dimensional properties of sculpture to create dynamic visual experiences that changed as viewers moved around the artwork. Hellenistic period innovations in Gorgonian representation emphasized psychological complexity and emotional depth that reflected contemporary literary and philosophical interests in character development and moral ambiguity. Artists created representations that suggested Medusa's awareness of her tragic fate while maintaining her supernatural power, developing iconographic conventions that could convey both victimization and divine authority within the same artistic composition. These sophisticated representations influenced Roman artistic traditions and contributed to the development of more psychologically complex mythological imagery. The transformation of Medusa's image from a monster to a beautiful woman with serpentine hair represented broader cultural changes in Greek society's understanding of feminine power and its relationship to beauty and danger. Classical period artistic representations began to emphasize Medusa's human characteristics while retaining the serpentine hair that mark her supernatural status, creating images that suggested potential for beauty and terror to coexist within the same being. This artistic evolution reflected changing social attitudes toward women's roles and capabilities as Greek society developed more complex understandings of feminine authority and influence. Late classical artistic innovations introduced elements of pathos and sympathy into Gorgonian imagery, creating representations that invited viewer empathy while maintaining the figure's apotropaic effectiveness. Artists developed techniques for suggesting Medusas suffering through subtle facial expressions and body language that conveyed tragic dignity without diminishing her supernatural power. These emotionally complex representations influenced subsequent artistic traditions and contributed to the development of more psychologically sophisticated mythological imagery throughout the Hellenistic period. Roman period adaptations of Gorgon imagery reflected imperial cultural values while maintaining connections to Greek religious and artistic traditions. Roman artists created representations that emphasized classical beauty and technical perfection, developing highly refined versions of the Medusa motif that serve both decorative and protective functions in domestic and public contexts. These Roman innovations influenced artistic traditions throughout the empire and contributed to the preservation of Gorgonian imagery in European cultural memory. The standardization of Gorgonian imagery across different artistic media and geographical regions demonstrated the motif's effectiveness as a universal symbol of protection and divine power. Artists working in various materials and cultural contexts developed consistent iconographic elements that maintain the symbol's recognition value, while allowing for local variations and innovations. This widespread adoption created a shared visual vocabulary that transcended regional boundaries and contributed to the development of a common Mediterranean cultural identity. The religious significance of Gorgonian imagery extended beyond simple apotropaic functions to encompass complex theological concepts about the transformation of destructive forces into protective ones through proper divine management. Temple decorations and ritual objects featuring the motif served as reminders of the god's ability to control chaotic forces while channeling their power toward beneficial purposes. These religious applications reinforce community faith in divine protection while demonstrating the effectiveness of proper ritual observance and moral behavior. The integration of Medusa's head into Athena's aegis created lasting changes in Greek religious iconography that influenced artistic and theological traditions throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The combination of wisdom, warfare, and transformed terror within a single divine symbol provided a powerful metaphor for the civilizing process through which dangerous natural forces could be domesticated and channeled toward protective purposes. This theological innovation contributed to the development of more sophisticated understandings of divine authority and its relationship to human civilization, establishing conceptual frameworks that would influence religious thought for centuries to come. The transformation of Medusa's image throughout the ancient world began during the Archaic period when Greek artists first developed a distinctive visual vocabulary that would define Gorgon imagery for centuries. The earliest representations, from the 7th and 6th centuries BC, emphasized raw supernatural terror over aesthetic refinement, creating mask-like faces that prioritize aperture-pick function above artistic beauty. These primitive Gorgon designs featured exaggerated facial elements that immediately conveyed danger and otherworldly power to viewers who encountered them on temple facades, pottery, and military equipment. Archaic period artists working in various media developed standardized iconographic elements that became essential components of Gorgon imagery across the Greek world. The characteristic protruding tongue, often depicted as unnaturally long and serpentine, served both as a symbol of death and as a visual representation of the Gorgon's ability to speak curses or incantations. This feature appeared consistently on pottery from Corinth, Athens, and other major ceramic production centers, suggesting widespread cultural agreement about its symbolic importance. The tongue's exaggerated size and prominent position created immediate visual impacts that enhanced the aperture-pick effectiveness of objects bearing Gorgonian decoration, while unkempt hair represented another crucial element of early Gorgon iconography. Though the serpentine nature of Medusa's locks often remained implicit rather than explicitly depicted in archaic representations, artists suggested the supernatural quality of Gorgon hair through flowing, dynamic lines that create impressions of constant movement and barely controlled chaos. Pottery painters developed techniques for rendering hair that appear to writhe and twist independently of natural wind patterns, using curved brushstrokes and overlapping forms that suggested the presence of living serpents without requiring detailed accuracy. The bulging eyes that characterized archaic Gorgon design served multiple symbolic and practical functions within the broader context of Greek religious and artistic traditions. These oversized ocular features emphasized the deadly nature of the Gorgon's gaze, while creating focal points that drew viewer attention to the most dangerous aspect of these supernatural beings. Vase painters and sculptors developed conventions for depicting eyes that appeared unnaturally large and prominent, often using contrasting colors or metallic inlays to create visual effects that suggested supernatural luminosity or inner fire. Facial features in archaic Gorgon imagery consistently emphasized bestial rather than human characteristics, with prominent fangs, flattened noses, and exaggerated jaw structures that suggested predatory animals rather than divine beings with human ancestry. These animalistic elements connected Gorgon imagery to broader Greek concepts about the relationship between civilization and wildness, positioning these figures as representatives of untamed natural forces that existed outside the boundaries of organized human society. The artistic emphasis on non-human features reinforced theological concepts that distinguish primordial deities from the more anthropomorphic Olympian gods who governed classical Greek religion. Regional variations in archaic Gorgon imagery reflected local artistic traditions and cultural preferences while maintaining essential iconographic elements that ensured universal recognition throughout the Greek world. Corinthian pottery featured Gorgon faces with particularly elaborate decorative elements, including intricate patterns around the eyes and mouths, showcasing the technical prowess of the local ceramic workshops. Athenian artists pioneered unique methods of portraying Gorgon hair and facial expressions, prioritizing psychological depth over mere ornamentation. East Greek workshops in Ionia crafted versions that absorbed artistic influences from the Near East, resulting in Gorgon designs that melded Greek mythological content with foreign aesthetic elements. The transition from archaic to classical artistic styles during the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC ushered in profound shifts in Gorgon representation, mirroring broader cultural changes in Greek society's comprehension of beauty, divinity, and a connection between physical appearance and spiritual authority. Artists of the classical period began to experiment with more lifelike depictions of human anatomy and facial features, creating a tension between the age-old requirements for warding off evil and the burgeoning aesthetic preferences for idealized beauty and harmonious proportions. Early classical innovations in Gorgon imagery first surfaced in high-status artistic settings, including temple sculptures and luxury metalwork commissioned by affluent patrons who could afford to explore experimental approaches to traditional religious imagery. The Temple of Athena Phaia on Aegina, constructed around 500 to 490 BC, boasted pediment sculptures that incorporated Gorgon elements rendered with unprecedented attention to anatomical accuracy and emotional expression. These architectural sculptures illustrated how traditional protective imagery could be adapted to align with classical period aesthetic standards without sacrificing its fundamental protective functions. Vase paintings from the early 5th century BC reveal a gradual evolution toward more humanized Gorgon features, with artists diminishing the prominence of bestial elements while preserving essential supernatural characteristics. Red figure pottery from this era depicts Medusa with increasingly human facial proportions, though the serpentine hair and deadly gaze remain distinctly indicated through artistic conventions established during the Archaic period. These transitional representations suggest that artists were responding to evolving cultural attitudes while honoring established religious traditions that mandated certain iconographic elements for proper protective function. The High Classical period saw dramatic innovations in Gorgon representation that fundamentally altered the balance between beauty and terror in these traditional images. Artists working during this era developed sophisticated techniques for crafting faces that combine classical ideals of feminine beauty with supernatural attributes, producing representations that captivated viewers while simultaneously conveying divine power and potential danger. This artistic achievement demanded unprecedented technical skill and cultural sensitivity, as artists had to navigate the delicate balance between aesthetic innovation and religious conservatism. Sculptural representations from the High Classical period demonstrate the most successful attempts to reconcile beauty with terror in Gorgon imagery. The Medusa Rondinini, a Roman marble copy of a Greek original from around 440 to 430 BC, exemplifies the classical solution to this artistic challenge. The sculpture features a face of extraordinary beauty rendered according to contemporary standards of feminine perfection, with regular features, smooth skin, and an expression of tragic dignity that elicits viewer sympathy. However, the serpentine hair and slightly parted lips hint at the supernatural nature and deadly power that distinguish this figure from ordinary mortal women. Relief sculptures from classical period buildings display similar approaches to humanizing Gorgon imagery while preserving its essential protective functions. The Parthenon's metope sculptures include Gorgonian elements that demonstrate how traditional protective symbols could be integrated into architectural contexts, celebrating Athenian cultural achievements and divine patronage. These reliefs feature Gorgon faces that emphasize classical beauty and technical excellence, while maintaining enough supernatural characteristics to ensure recognition and effectiveness as protective symbols. Metalwork in the classical period, including bronze mirrors, jewelry, and armor decoration, reveals how luxury craftsmen adapted Gorgon imagery for elite consumers who demanded both protective benefits and aesthetic refinement. These objects often featured highly detailed representations that showcased technical virtuosity while serving practical protective functions. Bronze mirrors with Gorgonian handles combine functional utility with supernatural protection, creating objects that enhance personal beauty while warding off malevolent influences that might threaten the user's welfare or appearance. The late classical and early Hellenistic periods brought further innovations in Gorgon representation, emphasizing psychological complexity and emotional depth over simple terror or beauty. Artists during this period developed techniques for suggesting Medusa's tragic awareness of her fate, creating representations that combined supernatural power with human vulnerability in ways that reflected contemporary literary and philosophical interests in character development and moral ambiguity. Hellenistic innovations in Gorgon imagery reflected broader cultural changes that emphasized individual psychology and emotional experience over collective religious observance and civic identity. Artists created increasingly personalized interpretations of traditional mythological figures, developing representations that suggested unique personality traits and individual responses to divine punishment or transformation. These psychological approaches to mythological imagery influenced artistic traditions throughout the Hellenistic world and contributed to the development of more complex visual narratives that could convey multiple layers of meaning within single compositions. Roman adaptations of Greek Gorgon imagery began during the Republican period as Roman artists and patrons encountered Greek artistic traditions through military conquest and cultural exchange. Early Roman representations typically copied Greek models with varying degrees of accuracy and understanding, creating versions that maintain essential iconographic elements while reflecting Roman cultural values and aesthetic preferences. Republican period Roman art shows a gradual development of distinctive approaches to mythological imagery that combine Greek technical excellence with a Roman emphasis on historical narrative and political symbolism. Imperial Roman innovations in Gorgon representation reflected the empire's cosmopolitan character and its integration of diverse cultural traditions from throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman artists working during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD developed sophisticated syntheses of Greek mythological content with Egyptian, Near Eastern, and indigenous Italian artistic elements, creating representations that appeal to diverse audiences while maintaining essential protective functions. These imperial period innovations influenced artistic traditions throughout the Roman world and contributed to the preservation of classical mythological imagery in European cultural memory. Roman literary treatments of the Medusa myth, particularly Ovid's influential account in the Metamorphoses, provided new interpretive frameworks that influenced artistic representation throughout the imperial period. Ovid's emphasis on transformation, divine punishment, and the relationship between beauty and monstrosity created a narrative context that supported more psychologically complex visual representations. Artists responding to Ovid's literary innovations developed techniques for suggesting temporal progression and emotional development within static visual compositions, creating images that implied the story of Medusa's transformation from beautiful priestess to terrifying monster. Architectural applications of Gorgon imagery in Roman context demonstrated the empire's systematic approach to incorporating protective symbols into public and private buildings. Roman architects developed standardized approaches to placing Gorgonian elements in strategic locations that maximize their protective effectiveness while contributing to overall decorative schemes that celebrated imperial power and cultural sophistication. These architectural applications created visual environments that combined aesthetic pleasure with supernatural protection, reflecting Roman confidence in their ability to control and direct divine forces toward beneficial purposes. Roman domestic context provided new opportunities for Gorgon imagery that reflected the empire's emphasis on private luxury and personal protection. Wealthy Roman households incorporated Gorgon motifs into floor mosaics, wall paintings, and decorative objects that serve both aesthetic and protective functions within domestic spaces. These private applications often featured more intimate and personalized interpretations of traditional imagery, creating representations that addressed individual concerns about family welfare, personal safety, and household prosperity. The spread of Gorgon imagery throughout the Roman world occurred through multiple channels that reflected the empire's complex cultural and economic networks. Military conquest brought Roman soldiers and administrators into contact with local artistic traditions that were then modified to incorporate Roman iconographic elements and cultural values. Trade relationships facilitated the exchange of decorated objects and artistic techniques between different regions of the empire, creating hybrid styles that combine local traditions with imperial Roman standards. Greek colonization during the Archaic and Classical periods had established Gorgon imagery throughout the Mediterranean world centuries before Roman expansion, creating cultural foundations that facilitated later Roman adaptation and development of these traditional motifs. Greek colonies in southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and the Black Sea region had introduced local populations to Greek mythological imagery and its associated religious and cultural meanings, establishing artistic traditions that continue to influence regional culture long after political independence had ended. The persistence of Gorgon imagery in diverse cultural contexts throughout antiquity demonstrates the universal appeal of protective symbols that could transcend specific religious and political boundaries while maintaining essential protective functions. Local populations throughout the Mediterranean world adapted Greek and Roman versions of Gorgon imagery to address their own cultural needs and aesthetic preferences, creating regional variations that preserved essential protective meanings while reflecting local artistic traditions and cultural values. Provincial Roman art from regions such as Gaul, Britain, and the Danubian provinces shows creative adaptation of classical Gorgon imagery that incorporated indigenous artistic elements and cultural symbols. These provincial interpretations often emphasize different aspects of the traditional imagery, creating representations that address local concerns about supernatural protection while demonstrating cultural integration with the broader Roman world. The success of these adaptations contributed to the long-term survival of classical mythological imagery in European cultural traditions that extended far beyond the collapse of Roman political authority. The technical evolution of Gorgon representation across different artistic media reflects the development of increasingly sophisticated manufacturing techniques and artistic capabilities throughout antiquity. Early archaic pottery painting required relatively simple tools and techniques that limited artistic complexity and detail, while later developments in metalwork, sculpture, and mosaic creation provided opportunities for more elaborate and technically demanding representations. These technological advances enabled artists to create increasingly realistic and emotionally compelling versions of traditional imagery that maintained protective effectiveness while achieving new levels of aesthetic sophistication. The standardization of Gorgon iconography across vast geographical distances and diverse cultural contexts demonstrates the effectiveness of visual communication systems that could transcend linguistic and cultural barriers while maintaining essential symbolic meanings. Trade networks, military campaigns, and cultural exchange facilitated the spread of standardized iconographic elements that ensured universal recognition of protective symbols throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. This standardization process created shared visual vocabularies that contributed to the development of common cultural identities that transcended local political and ethnic boundaries. The medieval period witnessed a fascinating transformation of Medusa imagery as Christian Europe grappled with pagan mythological symbols, while simultaneously recognizing their enduring cultural power and artistic appeal. During the early medieval centuries, roughly from the 5th to 10th centuries AD, classical mythological imagery largely disappeared from European art as Christian iconography dominated religious and secular decoration. However, Medusa's image proved remarkably resilient, surviving in various forms that reflected medieval attempts to reconcile pagan symbolism with Christian theological frameworks. Byzantine artistic traditions maintained connections to classical antiquity through their preservation of Greek and Roman decorative motifs, including modified versions of Gorgonian imagery that appeared on imperial regalia, architectural decoration, and luxury objects. Byzantine craftsmen adapted traditional Medusa representations to serve Christian symbolic purposes, transforming the Gorgon's terrifying visage into a symbol of divine justice and the defeat of evil forces. Imperial crowns and ceremonial objects featured stylized Gorgonian designs that emphasized the emperor's role as God's representative on earth, capable of confronting and defeating supernatural threats to Christian civilization. Medieval Islamic art in regions that had formerly been part of the Byzantine and Roman empires preserved classical mythological imagery through different cultural filters, creating hybrid representations that combine Greek mythological content with Islamic artistic conventions. Manuscript illuminations and decorative objects from the Islamic world occasionally featured figures that clearly derived from classical Gorgon imagery, though these were typically reinterpreted as jinn or other supernatural beings that fit within Islamic cosmological frameworks. The preservation of these classical elements in Islamic art created important links in the chain of cultural transmission that would eventually facilitate the Renaissance rediscovery of classical mythology. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries marked the beginning of systematic medieval engagement with classical literary and artistic traditions, including renewed interest in mythological narratives and their symbolic meanings. Carolingian manuscripts occasionally featured illustrations derived from classical sources, including simplified versions of Perseus' quest that emphasized the hero's Christian virtues of courage and divine favor. These early medieval interpretations typically strip away the more complex psychological and theological elements of the original myths, focusing instead on straightforward narratives of good triumphing over evil that align with Christian moral frameworks. The 12th century Renaissance brought a more sophisticated engagement with classical mythology as medieval scholars gained access to previously unknown ancient texts and developed new interpretive frameworks for understanding pagan literature. Medieval commentators on Ovid's Metamorphoses created elaborate allegorical interpretations of the Medusa myth that transformed Perseus' quest into a Christian allegory about the soul's struggle against sin and temptation. These interpretations typically identified Medusa with pride, lust, or other deadly sins, while Perseus represented the Christian warrior armed with faith and divine grace. Gothic cathedral architecture of the 12th and 13th centuries incorporated elements derived from classical Gorgon imagery into their complex decorative schemes, though these were typically disguised as demons, gargoyles, or other supernatural figures that serve Christian symbolic purposes. The famous gargoyles of Notre Dame de Paris and other Gothic cathedrals often featured faces that combine human and monstrous characteristics in ways that clearly echoed classical Gorgon iconography, while serving the practical function of water drainage and the symbolic function of warding off evil influences from sacred spaces. Medieval manuscript illumination provided crucial venues for preserving and transmitting classical mythological imagery throughout the period when such material was otherwise absent from European artistic production. Illuminated copies of classical texts, particularly Ovid's works, featured miniature paintings that maintained visual connections to ancient artistic traditions while adapting them to medieval aesthetic conventions. The Morgan Library's 14th century manuscript of Ovid's Metamorphoses contains remarkable illustrations of Perseus's encounter with Medusa that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of the classical narrative while reflecting contemporary artistic styles and cultural values. The development of medieval romance literature created new contexts for classical mythological figures, including Medusa, who occasionally appeared as obstacles or challenges in chivalric narratives. Medieval romances typically transformed classical monsters into opponents that tested knights' courage and virtue, creating Christian allegories that use familiar mythological figures to explore contemporary moral and spiritual concerns. These literary adaptations maintain cultural memory of classical mythology while adapting it to serve medieval Christian purposes and values. Renaissance humanism of the 14th and 15th centuries initiated a systematic rediscovery and reinterpretation of classical mythology that would fundamentally transform European culture's relationship to ancient Greek and Roman traditions. Humanist scholars developed new approaches to classical texts that emphasize historical understanding and literary appreciation rather than purely allegorical interpretation, creating intellectual frameworks that supported more accurate reconstruction of ancient mythological narratives and their original cultural meanings. Early Renaissance artists began incorporating classical mythological subjects into their work as patrons, and audiences developed a new appreciation for ancient cultural achievements and their relevance to contemporary concerns. Donatello's bronze Perseus with the head of Medusa, completed around 1440 to 1450, represents one of the earliest Renaissance attempts to recreate a classical sculptor's approach to mythological subjects while demonstrating contemporary artistic innovations and technical capabilities. The sculpture's anatomical accuracy and psychological complexity reflected Renaissance interest in individual character and emotional expression that went beyond medieval symbolic interpretations. The invention of printing during the 15th century facilitated the widespread distribution of classical texts and their accompanying illustrations, creating new opportunities for artists and writers to encounter ancient mythological narratives and develop their own interpretations. Printed editions of Ovid's Metamorphoses became particularly influential in spreading knowledge of classical mythology throughout European intellectual circles, providing standardized versions of mythological narratives that could serve as sources for artistic and literary works. Renaissance artistic treatment of the Medusa myth reached new levels of sophistication during the High Renaissance as artists developed techniques capable of representing the complex psychological and symbolic dimensions of classical mythology. Leonardo da Vinci's lost painting of Medusa's head, described by contemporary sources as terrifyingly realistic, reportedly demonstrated the artist's ability to combine classical subject matter with innovative artistic techniques that created unprecedented emotional impact. Although the original work has not survived, contemporary descriptions suggest that Leonardo successfully balanced beauty and horror in ways that recall the most sophisticated ancient representations. Michelangelo's approach to mythological subjects, including his drawings and sketches related to the Perseus myth, demonstrated Renaissance artists' growing confidence in their ability to match or exceed ancient artistic achievements. While developing distinctly contemporary approaches to classical themes, his studies for potential sculptural projects featuring Perseus and Medusa showed a deep understanding of classical narrative structure while incorporating Renaissance innovations in anatomical representation and emotional expression. Caravaggio's revolutionary approach to mythological painting during the late Renaissance created new possibilities for representing classical subjects with unprecedented psychological realism and emotional intensity. His painting Medusa, created around 1597 for Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, featured the severed head painted on a ceremonial shield that recreated the appearance of Athena's aegis, while demonstrating the artist's mastery of dramatic lighting and realistic representation. The work's combination of classical subject matter with innovative artistic techniques exemplified Renaissance success in reviving ancient cultural traditions while adapting them to contemporary aesthetic and intellectual standards. The Baroque period of the 17th century brought new dramatic interpretations of classical mythology that emphasized emotional intensity, and spectacular visual effects over the Renaissance focused on classical restraint and idealized beauty. Baroque artists created increasingly dynamic representations of mythological narratives that used dramatic lighting, exaggerated gestures, and complex compositions to create powerful emotional responses in viewers who encountered these works in religious and secular contexts. Peter Paul Rubens' paintings featuring Perseus and Medusa demonstrated Baroque mastery of complex narrative composition and dynamic figure representation that brought classical mythology to life with unprecedented energy and visual excitement. His painting Perseus freeing Andromeda, completed around 1620 to 1621, featured the hero displaying Medusa's severed head while rescuing his future bride from the sea monster, creating a complex narrative composition that celebrated heroic virtue while demonstrating the artist's technical virtuosity and creative imagination. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculptural approach to mythological subjects during the Baroque period created three-dimensional narratives that captured specific moments of dramatic action with unprecedented realism and emotional intensity. His marble sculpture Perseus with the head of Medusa, completed around 1644 to 1654, demonstrated how classical mythological subjects could be adapted to serve contemporary artistic and cultural purposes while maintaining connections to ancient narrative traditions. The neoclassical movement of the 18th and early 19th centuries brought renewed interest in classical mythology as European intellectuals developed a new appreciation for ancient Greek and Roman cultural achievements and their relevance to contemporary political and social concerns. Neoclassical artists created works that emphasized classical restraint and idealized beauty, while using mythological subjects to explore contemporary themes of heroism, virtue, and political liberty that resonated with Enlightenment values and revolutionary politics. Antonio Canova's marble sculpture Perseus Triumphant, completed between 1797 and 1801, exemplified neoclassical success in recreating the aesthetic and emotional impact of ancient sculpture while addressing contemporary cultural concerns. The work featured Perseus holding Medusa's severed head while displaying the classical contrapposto pose that had been perfected by ancient Greek sculptors, creating a synthesis of ancient artistic techniques with contemporary cultural values that celebrated individual heroism and the triumph of reason over superstition. Jacques-Louis David's paintings featuring classical mythological subjects demonstrated how neoclassical artists could use ancient narratives to address contemporary political concerns while maintaining historical accuracy and artistic excellence. His approach to mythological painting emphasized moral instruction and civic virtue that aligned with Enlightenment educational goals, while creating works of lasting artistic merit that continued to influence European cultural development. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought new psychological interpretations of classical mythology that emphasized individual emotion and subjective experience over collective moral instruction and civic virtue. Romantic artists and writers developed approaches to mythological subjects that explored the psychological dimensions of ancient narratives, while using them to examine contemporary concerns about individual identity, creative expression, and the relationship between civilization and nature. The copyright Odor Giawatilda copyright Recalt's paintings and drawings featuring mythological subjects demonstrated romantic interest in the darker psychological aspects of ancient narratives that have been largely ignored by earlier artistic movements. His sketches related to the Perseus myth emphasize the horrific aspects of Medusa's transformation and death, while exploring the psychological impact of heroic violence on both perpetrators and victims. Eugène Delacroix's approach to mythological painting combined romantic emphasis on emotional intensity with a sophisticated understanding of classical narrative structure, creating works that honored ancient literary traditions while addressing contemporary cultural concerns. His paintings featuring scenes from classical mythology demonstrated how romantic artists could use ancient subjects to explore modern themes of individual psychology and social criticism. Modern psychological interpretations of the Medusa myth began with Sigmund Freud's influential essay Medusa's Head, published posthumously in 1940, but written around 1922, which provided the foundation for subsequent psychoanalytic approaches to classical mythology. Freud interpreted Medusa's petrifying gaze as representing male castration anxiety, arguing that the sight of female genitalia could trigger unconscious fears about masculine identity and sexual power that manifested in the mythological narrative of transformation and death. Freud's analysis connected Medusa's serpentine hair to male anxieties about female sexuality and reproductive power, interpreting the snakes as phallic symbols that simultaneously represented and denied female sexual agency. This psychoanalytic framework influenced subsequent scholarly interpretations of the myth, while providing new theoretical tools for understanding the psychological dimensions of ancient mythological narratives and their continued relevance to modern cultural concerns. Carl Jung's analytical psychology offered alternative interpretations of the Medusa myth that emphasized archetypal patterns and collective unconscious elements rather than individual psychological conflicts. Jungian analysis interpreted Medusa as representing the shadow archetype, the dark aspect of human nature that individuals and societies must confront and integrate to achieve psychological wholeness and spiritual development. Jungian approaches to the Medusa myth emphasize the transformative potential of encountering terrifying aspects of the unconscious, interpreting Perseus' victory not as a simple heroic triumph, but as a successful integration of shadow elements that enables psychological growth and spiritual development. This interpretive framework influenced subsequent mythological scholarship, while providing theoretical foundations for therapeutic applications of classical narratives in contemporary psychological practice. Feminist scholarship beginning in the 1970s developed new interpretations of the Medusa myth that challenged traditional heroic narratives while emphasizing themes of female victimization and empowerment that had been largely ignored by earlier scholarship. Feminist scholars argued that traditional interpretations of the myth reflected patriarchal cultural values that celebrated male violence against women while ignoring the injustice of punishing victims for crimes committed against them. H.A. with tilde copyright Lonnie Six's influential essay The Laugh of Medusa, published in 1975, transformed feminist discourse about classical mythology by reclaiming Medusa as a symbol of female creative power and resistance to patriarchal oppression. Sixes argued that women should embrace the aspect of feminine identity that patriarchal culture found threatening, using Medusa's transformation from victim to powerful symbol as a model for female empowerment and creative expression. Contemporary feminist interpretations of the Medusa myth have emphasized themes of sexual violence, victim blaming, and the transformation of trauma into sources of personal and political power. These approaches have influenced artistic and literary works that use the Medusa figure to explore modern concerns about gender-based violence, social justice, and women's struggles for equality and recognition in male-dominated societies. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 19th and 20th centuries provided new evidence about ancient worship practices and symbolic meanings associated with Medusa and other Gorgon figures, contributing to a more accurate understanding of these mythological beings' original cultural significance. Excavations at Greek and Roman sites revealed the extensive use of Gorgon imagery in religious contexts that demonstrated the widespread importance of these protective symbols in ancient Mediterranean societies. The discovery of ancient temples featuring prominent Gorgonian decorations provided evidence about the religious functions of these symbols that went beyond simple protective uses to encompass complex theological concepts about divine protection and cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from sites such as the Temple of Artemis at Corfu revealed a sophisticated integration of Gorgon imagery into architectural programs that celebrated divine power while protecting sacred spaces from hostile influences. Pottery and metalwork discoveries from archaeological contexts throughout the Mediterranean world demonstrated the widespread distribution of Gorgonian imagery across diverse cultural and chronological contexts, providing evidence for the universal appeal of these protective symbols and their enduring significance in ancient societies. Their adaptation to local cultural needs and aesthetic preferences is noteworthy. These archaeological finds have significantly advanced scholarly comprehension of the cultural exchanges and artistic influences that played a crucial role in shaping ancient Mediterranean civilization. More recently, Archaeological endeavors at sites linked to ancient mystery religions have brought to light fresh evidence regarding the utilization of Gorgon imagery, initiation rituals, and esoteric religious practices. These practices offered alternative perspectives on the spiritual significance of these mythological figures. Discoveries made at sites associated with Dionysiac and Orphic cults have illustrated the manner in which Gorgonian symbols were integrated into religious practices. These practices placed emphasis on spiritual transformation and encounters with the divine, rather than simply serving as protection from hostile forces. The Medusa myth's contemporary cultural impact extends far and wide, permeating numerous facets of modern life. This includes popular entertainment, commercial branding, political activism, and even therapeutic practices. Medusa's image has evolved into a potent symbol for a diverse range of contemporary movements and cultural phenomena, serving as a visual representation to tackle modern anxieties surrounding power, identity, and social justice. The fashion and luxury goods sectors have embraced Medusa imagery as an emblem of power and sophistication. Renowned brands such as Versace prominently featured a Gorgon as their corporate logo, intending to evoke a sense of glamour, danger, and an irresistible allure. These commercial applications serve as a testament to the enduring cultural power of classical mythological imagery, while simultaneously adapting it to suit contemporary marketing and branding objectives aimed at reaching a global audience. Popular culture portrayals of Medusa in films, television shows, literature, and video games have given rise to novel interpretations of the classical myth. These interpretations engage with contemporary concerns while maintaining a connection to ancient narrative traditions. These modern adaptations frequently highlight themes of female empowerment, social justice, and the transformation of victimization into sources of personal strength and political activism. The hashtag #MeToo movement and ongoing conversations surrounding sexual violence have embraced Medusa as a symbol of women's anger and resistance against patriarchal oppression. Her transformation from a victim into a figure of immense power is used as a metaphor for survivors' capacity to reclaim their agency and demand justice. This political appropriation of the Medusa myth underscores the ongoing relevance of classical mythology in addressing contemporary social and political issues. Therapeutic applications of the Medusa myth in contemporary psychology and counseling have drawn upon both classical narrative elements and modern psychological theory. This has allowed for the creation of treatment approaches designed to assist individuals in processing trauma and fostering resilience. These therapeutic applications demonstrate how ancient mythological narratives can provide valuable frameworks for understanding and addressing contemporary psychological and social challenges. The enduring fascination with Medusa, spanning more than 2 millennia of human cultural evolution, underscores the myth's capacity to address fundamental concerns about power, identity, transformation, and justice. These concerns transcend specific historical and cultural contexts. From ancient Greek religious practices to contemporary feminist activism, the figure of Medusa has served as a powerful symbol for exploring the intricate relationships between beauty and terror, victimization and empowerment, and individual trauma and collective healing. Her transformation from an ancient monster into a modern symbol of resistance highlights mythology's remarkable ability to evolve and adapt while preserving essential symbolic power. This power continues to resonate with human experience across vastly different historical periods and cultural contexts. The Medusa myth's journey, tracing its origins from ancient Greek cosmology through medieval Christianity, Renaissance humanism, and modern psychological interpretation to contemporary political activism, exemplifies the dynamic nature of mythological narratives. It demonstrates their capacity to cater to evolving cultural needs while safeguarding essential insights into human nature and social organization. These insights remain relevant across time and cultural boundaries.